When Eleanor Mayfield stepped off that dusty stagecoach in 1887 Wyoming, her trembling hands carried more than just a carpet bag. They carried secrets dark enough to make a battle-hardened cowboy's hand shake until dawn. What she whispered to Caleb Boone on their wedding night would either destroy them both or forge the most unlikely love story the frontier had ever seen. Welcome to a tale of broken souls finding wholeness in the untamed American West. Stay with me until the very end of this epic story and drop a comment letting me know what city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these frontier tales travel across our modern world. The Wyoming Territory stretched endlessly under a bruised October sky, its vastness broken only by the weathered fence posts of the Boone Ranch and the distant silhouette of the Tetons. Caleb Boone stood on his porch, calloused fingers wrapped around a letter that had arrived 3 days ago. 3 days he'd spent avoiding its contents, like a man avoiding his own reflection. The paper crackled as autumn wind swept across the high plains, carrying with it the scent of coming snow and the ghost of memories he'd rather leave buried. His gray eyes, the color of storm clouds gathering over the mountains, fixed on the horizon where a dust plume rose like smoke from a distant fire. The stagecoach. She was coming. "Damn fool thing to do," he muttered, his voice rough from years of shouting orders over cattle drives and speaking to no one but his horse for months at a time. 34 years old and riding away for a wife like some desperate homesteader. But desperation had a way of making men do things they never imagined. The loneliness of the high country could drive a man to madness, and Caleb had been walking that razor's edge for too long. When his old Army friend Marcus Whitfield had written about a young widow in need of a fresh start, it had seemed like providence. Now, watching that dust cloud grow larger, it felt more like reckoning. The stagecoach rounded the bend where Willow Creek cut through his property, and Caleb could make out the driver's weathered face beneath his wide-brimmed hat. Old Pete Henderson had been running this route for 15 years carrying mail supplies, and the occasional passenger to the scattered ranches and mining camps that dotted this corner of Wyoming like stars in a vast empty sky. Caleb stepped down from the porch, his boots crunching on frost-brittle grass. He dressed carefully this morning. His best shirt, though it bore permanent stains from honest work, and his black vest that still fit snug across his broad shoulders. His dark hair longer than was fashionable, but practical for a man who cut it himself when he remembered was combed back from his angular face. The scar that ran from his left temple to his jawline, a souvenir from a Lakota war lance during his scouting days, caught the pale light. The stagecoach lurched to a stop in a cloud of dust and creaking leather. Pete Henderson spat a stream of tobacco juice and wiped his mouth with the back of his glove. "Afternoon, Caleb. Got a delivery for you." The door opened before Caleb could respond, and a small gloved hand appeared, gripping the frame with white-knuckled intensity. Then she emerged Eleanor Mayfield, though he didn't know her story, yet didn't know the weight of sorrows she carried or the steel that had been forged in the fires of her suffering. She was smaller than he'd expected, perhaps 5.5 feet tall, with auburn hair pulled back so severely it seemed to stretch the pale skin of her temples. Her dress was practical wool in deep blue, well-made, but not expensive, with tiny pearl buttons that caught what little sunlight filtered through the overcast sky. She clutched a worn leather carpet bag against her chest like armor, but it was her eyes that stopped him cold. They were the color of winter violets, beautiful and haunted, darting nervously from his face to the ground and back again. In those eyes, Caleb recognized something he'd seen in his own mirror for too many years, the look of someone who'd learned to flinch before the blow fell. "Mrs. Mayfield?" His voice came out rougher than he intended, and he cleared his throat. "I'm Caleb Boone." She nodded, a quick bird-like movement. "Mr. Boone." Her voice was soft, barely above a whisper, with the refined accent of the East still clinging to its edges despite years in the rough country. Pete Henderson climbed down and began unloading a small trunk from the boot of the coach. "This here's the last of it," he announced. "You folks need anything else, I'll be heading back to town." Eleanor stepped closer to retrieve her trunk, and Caleb caught a faint scent of lavender soap and something else, fear-sharp and metallic. When their hands accidentally brushed, as they both reached for the trunk handle, she jerked back as if she'd been burned. "I can manage it," Caleb said quickly, hefting the trunk easily. It was lighter than he'd expected, holding what seemed like a lifetime's worth of possessions condensed into one small container. "Thank you." She didn't meet his eyes. Pete Henderson climbed back onto his seat and gathered the reins. "You two take care now. Weather's turning ugly, should be here by nightfall." He touched the brim of his hat and clicked his tongue at the horses. As the stagecoach disappeared around the bend, an uncomfortable silence settled between them like morning fog. Caleb found himself studying her profile as she gazed toward the mountains, noting the way her jaw was set with determination, despite the fear that radiated from her like heat from a forge. "The house is just up the rise there," he said, finally, gesturing toward the log structure that had been his home for 8 years. It wasn't much to look at a main room with a stone fireplace, a kitchen lean-to, and a single bedroom that had felt more like a cell than a sanctuary since he'd built it. Eleanor nodded and fell into step beside him, her shorter legs working to match his stride. The wind picked up, sending dried leaves skittering across their path and making her skirts snap like flags. She shivered, and Caleb noticed she had no coat, only a thin woolen shawl wrapped around her shoulders. "You'll need warmer clothes," he observed. "Winter comes early and stays late up here." "I have some things," she replied quietly. "I'll manage." There was something in the way she said it, a stubborn pride wrapped around vulnerability, that reminded him of wounded animals he'd found over the years. They'd bite you even as you tried to help them, not out of meanness, but out of the knowledge that kindness was often a prelude to cruelty. The house came into view as they crested the small hill, and Caleb tried to see it through her eyes. The logs were still sound chinked tight against the wind with mud and moss. Smoke rose from the chimney, and the windows were clean if few. A vegetable garden, now mostly harvested, stretched along the south side, and a chicken coop sat near the kitchen door. It was practical, solid, isolated, everything a woman from civilization might find lacking. "It's not much," he said, suddenly conscious of the roughness of it all. "It's fine." But her voice held a note of something, resignation perhaps, or the kind of acceptance that came from learning not to hope for too much. They reached the porch, and Caleb set down her trunk to open the door. The hinges creaked. He made a mental note to oil them, and then they were inside the main room. It was warm from the fire he'd built that morning, furnished with handmade chairs and a table scarred from years of use. His rifle hung above the mantel next to a daguerreotype of his parents long dead, and the few books he owned were stacked on a shelf he'd built into the wall. Eleanor stood just inside the doorway, still clutching her carpet bag, taking in the masculine space with quick, darting glances. Her gaze lingered on the rifle, and something flickered across her features. Not fear exactly, but recognition. "You can put your things in the bedroom," Caleb said, then felt heat rise in his neck as he realized how that sounded. "I mean, I'll be sleeping in the barn until we figure things out." She looked at him, then really looked at him for the first time since stepping off the stage. Her violet eyes searched his face, as if trying to read his intentions in the lines around his eyes and the set of his mouth. "That's very considerate," she said finally. "Thank you." He carried her trunk into the bedroom. His bedroom, though it felt strange to think of it that way now. The bed he'd built himself dominated the small space covered with quilts his mother had made before the consumption took her. A washstand and mirror occupied one corner, and pegs on the wall held his extra clothes. It smelled of leather and wood smoke, and the particular loneliness of a man who'd slept alone for too many years. "There's water in the pitcher," he said, setting the trunk at the foot of the bed. "I'll bring in more wood for the fire. Supper." He paused, realizing he hadn't thought that far ahead. "I usually just make coffee and biscuits." "I can cook," Eleanor said quickly. "If you have supplies, I'd be happy to prepare something." "You don't have to." "I want to." There was something fierce in her voice, a need to contribute to prove her worth. "Please," Caleb nodded, understanding more than she might realize. "There's salt pork and beans in the larder, some onions and potatoes. Not much, but it'll keep us fed." She seemed to relax slightly at having a task, a purpose. "That will be fine." He left her to settle in and went outside to split wood, needing the familiar rhythm of the axe to settle his own nerves. The blade bit deep into the seasoned pine, sending chips flying with each stroke. Physical labor had always been his salvation, the one thing that could quiet the voices in his head that whispered of blood and bullets and the men who'd fallen beneath his guns. The wind carried the sound of her moving around inside footsteps on the plank floor, the scrape of a chair, the rattle of pans. Domestic sounds he hadn't heard in his home since his mother died. They should have been comforting, but instead they made him feel like an intruder in his own life. As the sun touched the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of copper and gold, snow began to fall. Just a few flakes at first, dancing on the wind like lost souls. But Caleb knew the signs. By morning, there would be inches on the ground and the high passes would be closed until spring. He gathered an armful of wood and headed back to the house, stamping his boots on the porch to knock off the mud. The smell that greeted him when he opened the door stopped him in his tracks. Beans and onions and something else, something that spoke of care and attention to detail. His stomach growled, reminding him that he'd been too nervous to eat much of anything all day. Eleanor stood at the stove, her back to him, stirring something in a cast-iron pot. She'd removed her shawl and rolled up her sleeves, revealing slender arms marked with what looked like old bruises faded to yellow-green but still visible in the firelight. When she heard him enter, she turned slightly, not quite meeting his eyes. "It's almost ready," she said. "I found some herbs growing wild behind the house sage, and what I think might be wild thyme. I hope you don't mind that I use them." "Mind?" Caleb set the wood down by the fireplace. "Haven't had a proper meal in longer than I care to remember. Thank you." She ducked her head at the praise, but he caught the ghost of a smile at the corners of her mouth. It transformed her face, hinting at a beauty that pain and fear had nearly extinguished. They ate in relative silence, the only sounds the pop and hiss of the fire and the increasing wind outside. The food was better than anything he'd tasted in years. The beans perfectly tender, the salt pork adding depth without overwhelming the delicate herbs she'd found. She ate sparingly, like someone accustomed to making a little go a long way. "Where are you from originally?" Caleb asked, trying to fill the silence that stretched between them like a chasm. "Pennsylvania," she replied, her fork pausing over her plate. "Near Philadelphia. My father had a small farm there." "Long way from home." Something shadowed her face. "I don't have a home anymore." The words hung in the air like smoke, heavy with meaning he didn't fully understand but recognized nonetheless. Home was something that could be lost in more ways than one he knew, that better than most. "What about you?" she asked quietly. "Have you always lived here?" "Built this place 8 years ago," Caleb said. "Before that I was traveling. Army Scout for a while, then other work. Decided I needed somewhere to settle down." He didn't mention the bounty hunting, the weeks spent tracking desperate men through the Badlands, the gunfights in dusty streets and dark alleys. Didn't mention the dreams that still woke him some nights, dreams of faces he'd never forget, and names he tried not to remember. Thunder rolled across the mountains, and Eleanor flinched, her hand flying to her throat in an unconscious gesture of protection. Rain began pattering against the windows, mixing with the snow, to create a slurry that spoke of a miserable night ahead. "Storm's getting worse," Caleb observed. "Good thing you made it when you did." She nodded, but her eyes had gone distant, focused on something he couldn't see. Her breathing had changed too, becoming shallow and quick, and her knuckles were white where she gripped her fork. "Eleanor." Her name felt strange on his tongue, intimate in a way that made him uncomfortable. "You all right?" She blinked, seeming to come back to herself. "Yes, Storms make me nervous." It was more than nervousness, he could see that clearly. It was the kind of bone-deep terror that came from experience, from memories that wouldn't stay buried. He'd seen it in soldiers after their first real battle, that look of someone who'd learned that the world was a far more dangerous place than they'd ever imagined. "You're safe here," he said quietly. "Whatever happened before, whatever you're running from, it can't reach you here." Her eyes snapped to his, wide and startled. "I never said I was running from anything. Didn't have to." Caleb pushed back from the table and began clearing the dishes. "Takes one to know one, I reckon." She was quiet for a long moment, watching him stack the plates with careful precision. When she spoke again, her voice was barely audible over the storm. "Why did you answer Marcus's letter? Why did you want a wife?" The question caught him off guard. He set down the plates and turned to face her, studying her pale face in the flickering firelight. How could he explain the crushing loneliness that had driven him to write to a stranger? How could he describe the way silence could become a living thing, a predator that stalked you through empty rooms and endless nights? "Man gets tired of talking to himself," he said finally. tired of waking up to nothing but wind and sky. Figured maybe it was time to try something different. And what if it doesn't work? What if we're... She paused, searching for the right words. What if we're too broken to be fixed? The vulnerability in her voice hit him like a physical blow. Here was someone who'd been hurt badly enough to question her own worth, her own capacity for happiness. He knew that feeling intimately. Then maybe we'll be broken together, he said. Sometimes that's enough. Lightning illuminated the windows, followed by a crash of thunder that shook the entire house. Eleanor gasped and half rose from her chair, her face pale as candle wax. Without thinking, Caleb stepped closer, his hands raised in a gesture of comfort. Hey, it's all right, just noise. But she was trembling now, her breathing coming in short, sharp gasps. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm sorry, I know it's foolish, but I can't. Breathe, Caleb said firmly. Look at me and breathe. Her violet eyes locked onto his, and he could see the struggle there, panic warring with the desperate need to appear strong. Slowly, carefully, he reached out and took her hand. She flinched, but didn't pull away, and he felt the fine tremors that ran through her like earthquake aftershocks. That's it, he said softly. In and out. You're here with me, and you're safe. They stood like that for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, her hand in his while the storm raged outside. Gradually, her breathing steadied, and some of the wild panic faded from her eyes. I'm sorry, she said again. You must think I think you're human, Caleb interrupted. And I think something happened to you that no one should have to survive. But you did survive it, and that makes you stronger than you know. She pulled her hand free, then wrapping her arms around herself in a protective gesture. You don't know anything about me. I know enough. He moved to the fireplace, adding another log to keep the flames bright. I know you've got the courage to get on a stage and travel 1,000 miles to marry a stranger. I know you can make a meal out of nothing and find herbs where other folks see only weeds. And I know someone hurt you bad enough that thunder sounds like something else entirely. Her sharp intake of breath told him he'd hit close to the mark. When he turned back to face her, tears were sliding silently down her cheeks. His name was Thomas, she whispered. Thomas Mayfield. I was 17 when my father arranged the marriage. He said Thomas would take care of me, provide for me. And he did in his way. He provided a roof and food and clothes, and in return... She couldn't finish, but she didn't need to. Caleb had seen enough of the world to fill in the blanks, and rage, cold and precise, settled in his chest like winter fog. Where is he now? The question came out harder than he intended. Dead. The word was flat, emotionless. Pneumonia took him last winter. His cousin Samuel says I owe him a debt, now that Thomas borrowed money against me. He says I belong to him now, to work off what Thomas owed. And what do you say? For the first time since stepping off that stagecoach, Eleanor Mayfield lifted her chin and looked him straight in the eye. I say I belong to myself. That's why I answered your letter, Mr. Boone. Not because I need a man to protect me, but because I need the law to recognize my right to choose. A married woman has more rights than a widow, even in the territories. The honesty of it, the clear-eyed assessment of her situation, impressed him more than any declaration of love could have. This wasn't a fairy tale or a romantic notion. It was survival, pure and simple, two people joining forces against a world that had shown them little kindness. Then we understand each other, Caleb said. This is a business arrangement with the possibility of something more. No pressure, no expectations beyond basic respect and common decency. Does that suit you? Relief flooded her features. Yes, that suits me perfectly. Another flash of lightning lit the room, but this time she didn't flinch. Instead, she squared her shoulders and began clearing the rest of the dishes from the table. I should let you get some rest, Caleb said. Morning comes early on a ranch storm or no storm. She nodded, then paused in her cleaning. Mr. Boone, thank you for understanding, for not expecting things. Caleb, he corrected, and you don't need to thank me for basic human decency. That ghost of a smile flickered across her face again. Caleb then, and you should call me Eleanor. Eleanor. He tested the name, liking the way it felt on his tongue. Sleep well. Tomorrow I'll show you around the place, properly introduce you to the livestock. She laughed, a sound like silver bells, rusty from disuse but still beautiful. I've never actually met a cow. They're not much for conversation, but they're honest creatures. You'll like them. He gathered his coat and hat from the peg by the door, preparing to brave the storm for the short walk to the barn. As he reached for the door handle, her voice stopped him. Caleb, in your letter to Marcus, what did you say you were looking for in a wife? He turned back to find her watching him with those extraordinary eyes, curiosity overriding caution, for perhaps the first time since her arrival. I said I was looking for someone who understood that life wasn't a fairy tale, he replied honestly, someone who knew the difference between love and partnership and wouldn't expect me to be something I'm not. And what are you? The question hung between them, heavy with possibility and danger. Outside the storm raged on, but inside the warm circle of firelight, something new was being born, tentative and fragile as a spring flower pushing through snow. I'm a man who's done things he's not proud of, Caleb said finally. A man who's trying to build something better than what he was. And you? Eleanor was quiet for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. When she did, her voice was steady, despite the tears that still tracked down her cheeks. I'm a woman who survived 7 years of being told she was worthless, she said, and I'm just beginning to remember that I'm not. The wind howled around the eaves of the house, but inside something had shifted. They were still strangers, still carrying the wounds of their separate pasts, but they were no longer quite so alone. Good night, Eleanor, Caleb said softly. Good night. He stepped out into the storm, pulling his hat low against the driving snow and rain. The barn was only 50 yards away, but by the time he reached it, he was soaked through. He lit a lantern and made his way to the stall where his mare Sage nickered a greeting. Evening, girl, he murmured, rubbing her velvety nose. Got ourselves some company. The barn was warm and familiar, smelling of hay and horses and the honest sweat of hard work. He'd made himself a comfortable enough nest in the tack room, a cot and blankets, a small stove for heat. It would do until what? Until they figured out what this arrangement between them really was. As he settled onto the narrow cot, listening to the storm batter the barn walls, Caleb found himself thinking about the woman in his house. Eleanor. She was nothing like what he'd expected when he'd answered Marcus's letter. He'd imagined someone practical and plain, maybe a little worn down by life, but fundamentally uncomplicated. Someone who would cook his meals and mend his clothes and not ask too many questions about the scars on his hands or the way he sometimes woke from dreams with his heart pounding. Instead, he'd gotten a woman who was beautiful, despite her obvious fear, intelligent, despite her circumstances, and strong in ways she probably didn't even recognize yet. A woman who carried her own dark secrets and her own quiet courage. A woman who could be dangerous to the careful walls he'd built around his heart. The storm showed no signs of letting up, and somewhere in the distance a wolf howled, a sound that spoke of loneliness and wild places and the eternal search for something that might ease the ache of solitude. Caleb pulled his blankets closer and tried to sleep, but his mind kept drifting to the house 50 yards away, and the woman who was probably lying awake listening to the same storm and wondering what the morning would bring. Tomorrow, he would show her the ranch, introduce her to the rhythms of his life. They would begin the delicate dance of learning to live together, two wounded souls trying to build something from the wreckage of their pasts. But tonight, as the storm raged and the wolves sang their ancient songs, Caleb Boone found himself doing something he hadn't done in years. Tonight, he found himself hoping. Dawn broke gray and cold over the Wyoming high country, the storm having spent itself some time before first light. Caleb woke to the sound of Sage whickering softly in her stall and the distant clatter of pans from the direction of the house. For a moment he lay still on the narrow cot, disoriented by the domestic sounds that drifted through the barn walls. Then memory flooded back Eleanor, the storm, the careful distance they'd established between them, like a treaty between wary nations. He dressed quickly in the cold air, his breath forming white puffs, as he pulled on his boots and shrugged into his coat. Outside, the world had been transformed by the storm. Snow blanketed everything in pristine white, broken only by the dark tracks of rabbits and the single line of footprints that led from the house to the chicken coop. She was already up tending to chores she had no obligation to handle. The kitchen windows glowed warm yellow against the pearl gray morning, and smoke rose straight up from the chimney in the still air. Caleb stamped his feet on the porch, giving her warning of his approach before he knocked softly and entered. Eleanor stood at the stove, her auburn hair braided neatly down her back, wearing a different dress than yesterday. This one, a practical brown wool that brought out the violet of her eyes. She looked up as he entered, and he caught a glimpse of something that might have been relief before she quickly looked away. "Good morning," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "I hope you don't mind I found the chickens and gathered the eggs. They seemed quite distressed by the storm." "They'll be grateful," Caleb replied, hanging his coat on the peg. "Chickens aren't fond of weather that can't make up its mind between rain and snow." She smiled at that, a real smile that transformed her entire face. "I made coffee, and there are biscuits in the oven. I found some preserves in the larder strawberry, I think." The domesticity of it should have felt natural, but instead it highlighted the strangeness of their situation. Here they were, two people who barely knew each other playing at being husband and wife, in a house where every silence carried the weight of unspoken questions. "You didn't have to do all this," Caleb said, accepting the cup of coffee she offered. It was strong and hot, exactly how he liked it, though he'd never told her that. "I wanted to earn my keep." There was that stubborn pride again, the determination to prove her worth. "Besides, I've been awake since before dawn. Storms, they make it difficult for me to sleep." He wanted to ask about the nightmares that had probably plagued her. Wanted to know what Thomas Mayfield had done to make thunder sound like violence to her ears. But the careful distance they'd established was fragile, and he wouldn't be the one to shatter it. "Once you've eaten, I'll show you around," he said instead. "Help you get your bearings." They ate in companionable silence, the morning light growing stronger beyond the windows. Eleanor picked at her food with the same careful restraint she'd shown the night before, as if abundance was something she couldn't quite trust. When she reached for the preserves, her sleeve rode up slightly, revealing more of those faded bruises on her wrist, finger-shaped marks that spoke of hands gripping too tightly too often. Caleb's jaw tightened, but he forced himself to look away. The past was the past, and Thomas Mayfield was beyond his reach now. But if this cousin Samuel ever showed his face on Boone land, well, that would be a different conversation entirely. After breakfast, they bundled into coats and stepped out into the transformed landscape. The snow crunched under their feet, and their breath steamed in the crisp air. Eleanor moved carefully, unused to the treacherous footing, and Caleb found himself offering his arm when they reached a particularly icy patch near the barn. She hesitated for a moment before accepting her small hand resting lightly on his forearm. Even through the thick wool of his coat, he could feel the delicate bones of her fingers, the subtle tremor that spoke of a fear she was trying hard to master. "The barn houses the horses and the milk cow," he explained as they approached the weathered building. "Sage is my mare. She's got a good temperament, won't give you any trouble if you need to ride. The cow is Bessie, and she's ornery as hell, but gives good milk." Eleanor laughed despite herself. "Ornery cattle. I'm learning that ranch life is full of personality." "Every animal out here has to have some fight in them to survive," Caleb said, pushing open the barn door. "The weak ones don't make it through the first winter." Was he talking about the animals, or was there a deeper meaning buried in those words? Eleanor glanced at his profile, noting the way his gray eyes seemed to see everything. The distant mountains, the sky that promised more snow. The careful way she held herself as if expecting a blow that might never come. Inside the barn, Sage nickered a greeting and thrust her velvety nose over the stall door. Eleanor approached cautiously, extending one tentative hand toward the mare's soft muzzle. "She's beautiful," Eleanor murmured as Sage investigated her fingers with gentle lips. "I've never been this close to a horse before." "Sage is special," Caleb agreed, producing a carrot from his pocket. "Here, let her take it from your palm. Keep your hand flat." Eleanor followed his instructions, gasping softly as the mare's whiskers tickled her palm. "She's so gentle." "Horses know things about people," Caleb said quietly. "They can sense fear, anger, kindness. Sage likes you. That's not something she gives easily." There was something in his voice that made Eleanor look at him sharply. Was he talking about the horse's judgment or his own? Before she could examine that thought too closely, a loud bellow from the far end of the barn demanded their attention. "And that would be Bessie," Caleb said with resignation. "Fair warning, she's got opinions about strangers." The milk cow was a sturdy Holstein with intelligent brown eyes and an attitude that radiated disdain for the entire human race. She regarded Eleanor with the sort of look usually reserved for particularly unwelcome dinner guests. "She's very expressive," Eleanor said diplomatically. "She's a pain in the ass," Caleb corrected. "But she gives 3 gallons a day and hasn't missed a milking in 2 years. Sometimes that's worth putting up with a bad attitude." As they continued the tour, the chicken coop with its collection of fluffy, indignant hens, the smokehouse where meat could be preserved through the long winter, the workshop where Caleb crafted the furniture and tools that kept the ranch running, Eleanor found herself relaxing incrementally. Here, away from the confines of the house, with its implications of intimacy and expectation, she could simply be a person learning about a new life. Caleb proved to be a patient teacher, explaining the rhythms of ranch life with the same careful attention he might give to training a horse. He showed her how to scatter feed for the chickens, how to check for eggs without getting pecked by the protective hens, how to read the sky for signs of changing weather. "Storm's not done with us yet," he observed, pointing to the bank of clouds gathering over the western peaks. "We'll get more snow before nightfall." Eleanor shivered, though whether from cold or the memory of the previous night's terror, she couldn't say. "How do you stand it? The isolation, I mean. When the snow comes, how long before you see another soul?" "Sometimes not until spring," Caleb admitted. "But you learn to find peace in the quiet. The land has its own conversation if you know how to listen." They had reached the fence line that marked the edge of his immediate property. Beyond stretched miles of open rangeland broken by distant buttes and the silver thread of Willow Creek. It was beautiful in its vastness, but also daunting, a reminder of how small and vulnerable human beings were in the face of such immensity. "It's so different from Pennsylvania," Eleanor said softly. "There you were never more than a few miles from a neighbor, never out of sight of church spires or mill wheels. This feels like the edge of the world." "Maybe it is," Caleb replied. "Maybe that's what some of us need, a place where the past can't follow, where you can start over without explaining yourself to every busybody in town." Eleanor glanced at him, noting the way his hands gripped the fence rail and the distant look in his eyes. "Is that what you came here for? A place to start over?" For a long moment, he didn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with old pain. "I did things during the war, after the war, that I'm not proud of. Killed men who probably didn't deserve killing, at least not by my hand. When the nightmares got bad enough, when I couldn't look at myself in a mirror without seeing their faces, I figured it was time to find somewhere they couldn't follow." The honesty of his confession hit her like a physical blow. Here was someone else who understood the weight of the past, the way memories could poison the present if you let them. "And did they follow you? I mean..." Caleb's smile was bitter. "Ghosts don't respect property lines, Eleanor. They go where they please. But out here with nothing but sky and wind for company, they seem quieter, more manageable." They stood in silence for a while, two people who had learned that survival sometimes meant running toward emptiness rather than away from it. The wind picked up, carrying with it the promise of more snow and the wild, clean scent of the high country. "We should head back," Caleb said finally. "I want to get the stock settled before the next storm hits." As they walked back toward the barn, Eleanor found herself studying his profile, the strong line of his jaw, the scar that marked him as a man who had seen violence, the way he moved with the unconscious grace of someone always ready for trouble. There was kindness in him, she was beginning to realize, but it was a careful kindness offered cautiously to those who proved themselves worthy of it. "Caleb." His name still felt strange on her tongue, intimate in a way that made her pulse quicken. "What did Marcus tell you about me in his letter?" He paused in his walk, considering his answer. "He said you were a widow in need of a fresh start, that you were intelligent, capable, and looking for a partnership rather than a fairy tale. He said you understood hard work and wouldn't expect more than a man could honestly give." "And what did you expect when you read that?" "I expected someone practical," Caleb admitted. "Someone who wouldn't ask too many questions or demand too much attention. Someone who could be content with a simple life in a hard place." Eleanor felt a stab of disappointment, though she couldn't say why. And now, am I what you expected? He stopped walking entirely, then turning to face her with those storm-gray eyes that seemed to see straight through to her soul. No, he said quietly. You're not what I expected at all. Before she could ask what he meant by that, a shout echoed across the snow-covered valley. They both turned toward the sound, and Caleb's entire demeanor changed. His hand dropped instinctively to where a gun would hang, and every line of his body tensed like a wolf scenting danger. "Riders coming," he said tersely. "Get to the house." Eleanor followed his gaze and saw them, 3 men on horseback, dark shapes against the white landscape riding hard toward the ranch. Even at a distance, there was something purposeful, almost predatory, about their approach. "Who are they?" she asked, though some instinct already whispered the answer. "I don't know." Caleb lied because he could see the quality of their horses, the deliberate way they rode, the fact that they were traveling in weather that would keep honest men by their firesides. "But I intend to find out. Get inside and lock the door." "Caleb, go." The command in his voice brooked no argument. "Now." Eleanor ran for the house, her skirts hampering her progress through the deep snow. Behind her, she could hear Caleb's boots crunching toward the barn, probably to retrieve the rifle she'd noticed hanging above the mantel. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she reached the porch and fumbled with the door latch. Inside, she pressed her back against the door and tried to catch her breath. Through the front window, she could see Caleb emerging from the barn, the rifle now cradled easily in his arms. He moved with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to violence, and for the first time since meeting him, Eleanor could clearly see the dangerous man he had once been. The riders were closer now, close enough that she could make out details. Heavy coats, low-pulled hats, the metallic glint of weapons. The lead rider was a large man with a dark beard, sitting his horse with the confidence of someone accustomed to getting his way through intimidation. Eleanor's blood turned to ice water in her veins. Even at a distance, even after months of believing herself safe, she recognized him. Samuel Morrison, Thomas's cousin, the man who claimed she belonged to him now. Her hands began to shake so violently she could barely grip the window frame. He had found her. Somehow, despite all her careful planning, despite choosing Wyoming territory specifically because it was as far from Pennsylvania as she could manage, Samuel had tracked her down. Outside, the 3 men reined their horses to a stop about 20 yards from where Caleb stood. The distance was deliberate, close enough to talk, far enough to draw weapons if necessary. Samuel dismounted with theatrical casualness, his boots crunching in the snow as he approached. Eleanor pressed closer to the window, straining to hear the conversation that would determine her fate. "Morning," Samuel called out, his voice carrying easily in the thin air. "You'd be Caleb Boone, I'm guessing." "I would." Caleb's response was flat, uninviting. "And you'd be trespassing on my land." Samuel laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "No offense intended, friend. Just come to collect what's mine. Don't see anything here that belongs to you." "Well, now that's where you're wrong." Samuel's tone remained conversational, but Eleanor could hear the steel beneath it. "I'm looking for a woman, Eleanor Mayfield, about so high reddish hair, violet eyes, real pretty when she's not being difficult. I have it on good authority she came through here recently." Caleb's grip on the rifle shifted almost imperceptibly. "Can't say as I know anyone by that name." "Now that's curious," Samuel mused, pulling off his gloves with exaggerated care. Because the stagecoach driver in town was real talkative about the young lady he delivered to the Boone Ranch just yesterday, described her right down to that little scar on her left hand. Eleanor's eyes flew to her left hand, to the thin white line across her palm, where Thomas's ring had cut her during one of his rages. Samuel knew her body like a piece of property he'd inventoried, and the thought made bile rise in her throat. "Even if I knew this woman," Caleb said carefully, "what business would that be of yours? Legal business." Samuel reached into his coat and withdrew a folded paper. "I have documents here that prove Eleanor Mayfield owes a substantial debt to the Morrison family. Her late husband borrowed against her person, if you understand my meaning. She's bound to work off that debt, and I'm here to collect." "Those documents wouldn't be worth the paper they're written on in this territory," Caleb observed. "Wyoming doesn't recognize debt bondage." Samuel's smile turned ugly. "Maybe not. But accidents happen out here in the wilderness, don't they? Man could disappear and never be found. Woman too, for that matter. Especially if she was already bound to someone who had every legal right to take her back to Pennsylvania. The threat hung in the air between them like poison. Eleanor found herself gripping the windowsill so tightly her knuckles had gone white. This was exactly what she had feared, what had driven her to answer Caleb's letter in the first place. Samuel would take her back, and this time there would be no escape. But Caleb didn't flinch. Instead, he took a step forward, and Eleanor could see the way his body had gone perfectly still, the stillness of a predator preparing to strike. Funny thing about accidents, Caleb said conversationally. They tend to happen to folks who go looking for trouble in places they don't belong. One of Samuel's companions, a thin man with nervous eyes, shifted in his saddle. Samuel, maybe we should— Shut up, Pete. Samuel's attention never wavered from Caleb. Now, Mr. Boone, I can see you're a reasonable man. I'm not looking for trouble with you, just want what's rightfully mine. You turn over the woman and we'll be on our way. No harm done. And if I don't— Samuel's hand dropped to rest on the butt of his pistol. Then I reckon we'll have to discuss the matter further. Eleanor couldn't stand it anymore. She couldn't hide behind the door while Caleb faced down 3 armed men on her behalf. Drawing a shaky breath, she opened the door and stepped onto the porch. Samuel. Her voice carried clearly across the snow, and all 4 men turned toward her. I wondered when you'd show up. Samuel's face lit up with triumph. There's my girl. You've led me a merry chase, Eleanor, but it's time to come home now. This is my home. The words came out stronger than she'd expected, fueled by a rage she was only beginning to recognize. I'm a married woman now, and that means your so-called claim is void. Samuel's expression darkened. Married to him. He jerked his head toward Caleb. When yesterday, that's mighty convenient timing, sweetheart. The timing doesn't matter, Eleanor said, stepping closer to the porch rail. The law is the law. We'll see about that. Samuel's voice had turned vicious. Because I don't think you are married. I think you're just playing house with this cowboy, hoping I'll give up and go home. But I've come too far and spent too much money tracking you down to be fooled by a charade. Caleb took another step forward, and now the rifle was openly threatening. The lady says she's married. That's good enough for me. But is it good enough for the law? Samuel pulled another paper from his coat. Because I happen to have a warrant here from Pennsylvania signed by a judge who agrees that Eleanor Mayfield is bound to me by legal debt. Now maybe you're married and maybe you're not, but until I see proof, she's coming with me. Eleanor felt the walls closing in around her. She had no proof of marriage because there had been no time for a ceremony. The local justice of the peace was 2 days' ride away in good weather, and Samuel had found her too quickly. What kind of proof would satisfy you? Caleb asked quietly. Samuel's smile was the expression of a snake eyeing a mouse. Oh, I think we both know the kind of proof I'm talking about. A marriage isn't real until it's been consummated. Isn't that right? And somehow, I don't think you two have gotten around to that yet. The crude implication hung in the air like a slap. Eleanor felt heat flood her cheeks, but it was anger now, not shame. How dare he reduce her to this, to a piece of property, to be haggled over by men who thought they owned her? You're disgusting, she said coldly. I'm practical, Samuel corrected. And I'm done playing games. Pete, Jake, go get her. The 2 mounted men started forward, but they hadn't gone 3 steps before Caleb's rifle swung to cover them. The sound of the lever action working was loud in the crisp air. First man who sets foot on my porch gets a bullet, Caleb said calmly. I'm real good with this rifle, boys. Won't even be much of a contest. The riders pulled up short, looking to Samuel for direction. For a moment, the tableau held 3 men with guns, 1 woman with nothing but stubborn courage, and 1 cowboy who had just declared war on behalf of a wife who wasn't really his wife. Samuel's face had gone red with fury. You're making a mistake, Boone, a big one. I've got legal documents and I've got enough men to take what's mine whether you like it or not. You've got 3 men, Caleb corrected. Against one who knows this country and has nothing left to lose. Those aren't odds I'd bet on if I were you. The wind whistled around the eaves of the house, and in the distance, thunder rumbled as the next storm approached. Eleanor could feel the situation spiraling toward violence, could see it in the way the men's hands hovered near their weapons, in the cold calculation in Caleb's eyes. And suddenly, she knew what she had to do. Samuel, she called out, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her throat. You want proof of marriage? Fine. Come back tomorrow evening. By then we'll have had time to establish the legitimacy of our union to your satisfaction. The words tasted like ashes in her mouth, but they had the desired effect. Samuel's attention swung back to her, his eyes narrowing as he tried to determine if she was bluffing. You'd do that? Let him just to spite me? Eleanor lifted her chin, drawing on reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed. I'd do whatever it takes to remain free of you. For a long moment, Samuel studied her face, looking for signs of deception. Finally, he nodded slowly. All right then. Tomorrow evening. But if I find out you're trying to trick me... He let the threat hang unfinished. You won't, Eleanor said firmly. Samuel remounted his horse, his movements jerky with suppressed rage. Tomorrow evening, then. And Eleanor, if you try to run again, I'll burn this place to the ground and hunt you to the ends of the earth. There's nowhere you can hide that I won't find you. With that cheerful promise, he wheeled his horse around and spurred it toward the valley road. His two companions followed, and within minutes they were dark shapes disappearing into the gathering storm. Eleanor stood on the porch until they were completely out of sight, her body rigid with the effort of maintaining her composure. Only when the last echo of hoofbeats had faded did she allow herself to sag against the porch rail. Caleb approached slowly, the rifle still in his hands, but no longer threatening. Eleanor, you all right? She laughed, a sound perilously close to hysteria. All right, I just promised to... She couldn't finish the sentence. You bought us time, Caleb said quietly. That was smart thinking. Smart thinking. Eleanor turned to face him, her violet eyes blazing with a mixture of fear and fury. I just promised to sleep with you to prove we're married. What exactly is smart about that? Caleb flinched as if she'd struck him. You don't have to do anything you don't want to do. We'll figure something else out. Like what? He'll be back tomorrow, and if we can't prove we're truly married, he'll take me back to Pennsylvania, and you'll probably end up dead for trying to stop him. The blunt assessment hung between them like a challenge. Eleanor was right, and they both knew it. Samuel Morrison had the look of a man who would do whatever it took to get what he wanted, and he wanted her with an obsession that bordered on madness. There has to be another way, Caleb said. If there is, we have about 18 hours to find it. Eleanor wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly feeling the cold that had nothing to do with the weather. Maybe it wouldn't be so terrible. You're not like Thomas. You're not cruel. No. The word came out harsher than he intended. You're not a piece of property to be used to solve problems. I won't let you sacrifice yourself for my sake. And I won't let you die for mine. The words exploded out of her with surprising force. Don't you understand? You're the first person in 7 years who's been kind to me. The first person who's made me feel like I might actually be worth something. I won't let Samuel destroy that. They stared at each other across the porch, the weight of unspoken possibilities stretching between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. The wind picked up, sending snow swirling around them, and in the distance thunder rolled again closer this time. We should go inside, Caleb said finally. Storm's coming, and we need to think this through. Eleanor nodded, though her legs felt unsteady as she walked toward the door. Behind them the mountains disappeared into gathering clouds, and the first fat snowflakes began to fall like tears from a gray sky. Inside the warm kitchen, they stood on opposite sides of the room, the domestic space suddenly charged with a tension that made the air itself seem to crackle. Eleanor moved to the stove, needing something to do with her hands, while Caleb hung the rifle back above the mantel with careful precision. How did he find you? Caleb asked quietly. Eleanor's hands stilled on the coffee pot. Samuel has resources, money connections. When I disappeared from Pennsylvania, he hired men to track me. It was only a matter of time. And the debt he mentioned. Real enough, I suppose. Eleanor's voice was bitter. Thomas gambled, drank, made poor investments. When he died, he owed money to several people, including Samuel. But the idea that I could be used as collateral, she shuddered. That's Samuel's invention. He's wanted me since before Thomas died, and now he thinks he's found a legal way to claim me. Caleb absorbed this information, his gray eyes thoughtful. Pennsylvania law might support his claim, but this is Wyoming territory. We have different ideas about women's rights out here. Will that matter if he simply takes me by force? The question hung in the air like smoke. They both knew the answer. Law was only as strong as the men willing to enforce it, and in this isolated valley there was only Caleb standing between Eleanor and Samuel's obsession. Outside, the storm was building in earnest. Wind howled around the eaves and snow lashed against the windows with increasing fury. By morning, the passes would be impassable, trapping them all in the valley until the weather cleared. There might be another way, Caleb said slowly. The justice of the peace in Willow Creek, Judge Patterson. If we could get to him, get properly married with legal documents. In this weather, Eleanor shook her head. It's 2 days hard riding in good conditions. We'd never make it through the storm. Not today, maybe, but if the weather clears... Samuel will be back tomorrow evening, Eleanor reminded him. There isn't time. They fell silent, each lost in their own thoughts. The fire popped and hissed in the grate, and somewhere in the distance a coyote howled a sound that spoke of wilderness and solitude and the harsh realities of survival in a land that offered no easy answers. Caleb, Eleanor's voice was barely above a whisper. If we went through with it, would it be so wrong? He looked at her, then really looked at her, taking in the way the firelight caught the auburn highlights in her hair, the delicate curve of her jaw, the violet eyes that held depths he was only beginning to fathom. She was beautiful, yes, but more than that, she was brave and intelligent and stronger than she knew. Under different circumstances, in a different world, he might have counted himself lucky to earn her affection honestly. But these weren't different circumstances, and the world was what it was. It would be wrong to take advantage of your situation, he said carefully. You're scared and desperate, and I won't be the kind of man who uses that against you. Eleanor took a step closer, her eyes never leaving his face. And what if I told you I wasn't just scared? What if I told you that when you held my hand last night during the storm, I felt safer than I have in 7 years? What if I said that the thought of Samuel taking me away from here, away from you, terrifies me more than anything he might do to me? Caleb's breath caught in his throat. Eleanor, I know it's not love. She continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. Not yet, anyway. But it could be something, couldn't it? Something real and honest and good. Something worth fighting for. The words hung between them like a promise and a prayer. Outside, the storm raged on, trapping them together in the warm circle of firelight, while forces beyond their control gathered like wolves at the edges of their small sanctuary. Caleb reached out then, his scarred hands gentle as they framed her face. Are you sure? Because once we cross this line, there's no going back. You'll be my wife in truth, and I'll be your husband. All the pain, all the ghosts, all the baggage we both carry, we'll be taking it on together. Eleanor leaned into his touch, her eyes closing briefly as if savoring the simple warmth of human contact offered without expectation of payment. I'm sure, she whispered. I've never been more sure of anything in my life. The wind howled around the house like a living thing, and in the distance, thunder rolled across the mountains. But inside the warm kitchen, two broken souls reached for each other across the darkness, hoping to find in their joining something stronger than the sum of their separate fears. The storm would rage until dawn, and tomorrow would bring Samuel Morrison and his demands for proof. But tonight belonged to them alone. The hours that followed passed like a dream wrapped in firelight and whispered confessions. They sat together on the rough-hewn bench before the hearth, Eleanor's small hand resting in Caleb's larger one, both of them understanding that something profound was shifting between them, something that went far beyond the desperate circumstances that had brought them to this moment. Tell me about your mother, Eleanor said softly, her fingers tracing the calluses on his palm. The quilts in the bedroom, they're beautiful. Caleb's eyes grew distant. Mary Catherine Boone, Irish to her bones with a temper to match and a heart big enough to forgive the world its sins. She died when I was 19, just before I joined the Army. Consumption took her slow, and she spent her last months making those quilts because she said a house without handmade covers was just a building, not a home. She sounds wonderful. She was, Probably would have taken a switch to me if she'd known the man I became after the war. His voice carried the weight of old regret. She believed people were fundamentally good, that even the worst of us could find redemption if we just tried hard enough. Eleanor studied his profile in the dancing firelight. Maybe she was right. Maybe that's what this is, a chance at redemption for both of us. The wind rattled the windows, but inside their small sanctuary time seemed suspended. They talked through the long hours, sharing fragments of their histories like precious gifts. Eleanor spoke of her childhood in Pennsylvania, of a father who'd loved books more than farming, and a mother who'd died too young, leaving her to navigate the treacherous waters of womanhood alone. Caleb told her about the war, about scouting missions that turned into bloodbaths, and the slow erosion of his soul that had followed. I killed my first man when I was 22. He said, his voice so quiet she had to lean closer to hear him. Confederate sniper who'd been picking off our boys for 3 days. I tracked him through a swamp in Louisiana, found him sleeping under a cypress tree. He was young, maybe 18, with a picture of a girl in his pocket and letters from home. I could have taken him prisoner, should have, but I was angry. Angry about the war, about my friends who'd died, about the whole bloody mess we'd made of the world. So I shot him while he slept, and I told myself it was necessary. After that, it got easier. Too easy. Eleanor's fingers tightened around his. How many? Enough. The word was flat final. More than enough. They were quiet for a while, watching the flames consume the logs with patient hunger. Finally, Eleanor spoke again, her voice barely audible above the storm. Thomas never hit me, she said. Not with his fists, anyway. He was too clever for that, too concerned with maintaining appearances. But there are other ways to hurt someone. Other ways to break them down until they forget they were ever whole. Caleb turned to look at her, seeing the pain that lived in her violet eyes like shadows in deep water. What did he do? He made me disappear, Eleanor said simply. Little by little, day by day, until I wasn't Eleanor anymore. I was just his wife, his possession, his thing to be used however he saw fit. He'd tell me I was stupid when I offered opinions frigid, when I didn't respond to his advances the way he wanted, worthless, when I failed to live up to his expectations. And the worst part was, I started to believe him. The confession hung between them like a bridge built of shared pain. Caleb understood then why she'd flinched from his touch. Why thunder sounded like violence to her ears, why she moved through the world like someone expecting punishment for simply existing. He was wrong, Caleb said fiercely, about all of it. You're not stupid or frigid or worthless. You're brave and kind and stronger than you know. Eleanor smiled through the tears that had begun to slide down her cheeks. How can you be so sure you've known me for 2 days? Because I recognize courage when I see it, Caleb replied. Takes real strength to get on a stagecoach and travel 1,000 miles to marry a stranger. Takes even more to stand up to a man like Samuel Morrison and refuse to be intimidated. I'm terrified, Mum, Eleanor whispered. Of him, of this, of what tomorrow might bring. Sometimes I think I've been scared for so long, I don't remember what it feels like to be brave. Courage isn't the absence of fear, Caleb said, brushing a tear from her cheek with his thumb. It's doing what needs to be done despite the fear. And you've been doing that since the day you decided to leave Pennsylvania. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the small house, but the fury seemed to be diminishing slightly. The wind still howled, but with less force, and the snow that lashed the windows had turned from hard pellets to softer flakes. It's getting late, Eleanor observed, though neither of them moved to separate. Yes, Caleb agreed. It is. The unspoken question hung between them. What happened next? They'd spent hours building a foundation of trust and understanding, but the physical reality of their situation remained unchanged. Samuel Morrison would return tomorrow evening expecting proof of consummation, and they had to decide how far they were willing to go to provide it. Caleb, Eleanor's voice was soft, uncertain. What I said earlier about us, I meant it, all of it. He searched her eyes in the firelight, looking for any sign of doubt or fear. Instead, he found a quiet determination that took his breath away. So did I, he said. But I need you to be sure, Eleanor, really sure, because once we... She silenced him by placing her fingers gently against his lips. "I know what I'm choosing," she said. "I'm choosing you. I'm choosing this. I'm choosing a future where I belong to myself and to someone who sees me as more than just property to be owned." The kiss that followed was soft, tentative, a question posed with lips and breath rather than words. Eleanor had been kissed before, but those kisses had been demands, taking what they wanted without regard for what she might freely give. This was different, an invitation she could accept or decline a conversation rather than a conquest. She chose to answer with her own lips, her own breath, her own gentle exploration of this new intimacy. When they finally broke apart, both of them were trembling slightly, not from cold, but from the magnitude of what they'd just begun. "Are you sure?" Caleb asked one more time, his forehead resting against hers. "I'm sure," Eleanor whispered. "I want this. I want you." What followed was a slow dance of discovery conducted in the warm glow of firelight while the storm raged outside. They moved to the bedroom with careful steps, both of them acutely aware that they were crossing a threshold that would change everything between them. Caleb lit a lamp while Eleanor stood by the window watching the snow fall in the darkness beyond. When he turned back to her, she was silhouetted against the glass, her auburn hair loose around her shoulders, where she'd unpinned it, her slight form somehow both fragile and resilient in the golden light. "Eleanor," he said softly, and she turned to face him. What passed between them then was tender beyond words, a joining of two souls who had found in each other not just passion, but sanctuary. They came together slowly, carefully, with a gentleness born of understanding, rather than mere desire. This wasn't about proving anything to Samuel Morrison or satisfying the crude demands of territorial law. This was about two people choosing to trust each other with their most vulnerable selves. Eleanor had never known that intimacy could be kind, that a man's hands could offer comfort rather than control, that her own body could respond with something other than duty or endurance. Under Caleb's patient touch, she discovered parts of herself that Thomas had tried to destroy: the capacity for joy, for pleasure, for the simple human connection that made life worth living. And Caleb, who had spent years believing himself irredeemably stained by violence, found in Eleanor's trust a kind of absolution he'd never thought possible. In her violet eyes, he saw not judgment for his past sins, but hope for a future they might build together. Afterward, they lay entwined beneath his mother's quilts, listening to the wind and the settling of the house around them. Eleanor's head rested on Caleb's chest. Her hair spread like silk across his skin, and for the first time in 7 years, she felt completely safe. "I don't go away in my mind anymore," she murmured against his throat, echoing words from the previous night, but with new meaning now. "I stay here with you." Caleb's arms tightened around her. "I'm glad," he said simply, "because I want you to stay. Not just until Samuel leaves, not just until spring, but for always, if you'll have me." "Is that a proposal, Mr. Boone?" "I reckon it is, Mrs. Boone." They slept then deeply and peacefully, two people who had found in each other what they'd never thought to hope for. But even in their contentment, both were aware that the dawn would bring new challenges, new threats to the fragile happiness they'd built in the space of a single night. Morning came gray and cold, the storm having blown itself out sometime before dawn. Eleanor woke to find herself alone in the bed, though the impression of Caleb's body remained warm beside her. Through the window, she could see him moving around the barn, already at work, despite the early hour. She dressed quickly, braiding her hair with fingers that still trembled slightly from the memory of his touch. In the kitchen, she found that he'd already started coffee and laid out the makings of breakfast. Small gestures of consideration that spoke louder than words about the kind of man he was. When Caleb returned from his morning chores, stamping snow from his boots on the porch, Eleanor was standing at the stove scrambling eggs. He paused in the doorway, taking in the domestic scene. His wife, he realized with a jolt of possessive satisfaction, cooking breakfast in their kitchen. "Morning," he said, his voice rough with more than just the cold. Eleanor turned to smile at him. And in that smile, he saw no regret for what had passed between them, no fear of what the day might bring. Instead, he saw a quiet joy that made his heart clench with an emotion he was only beginning to recognize as love. "Good morning, husband," she said, and the words sounded exactly right on her lips. They ate breakfast in comfortable silence, both of them aware that the peaceful morning was borrowed time. Samuel Morrison would be back, and they needed to be ready for him. "What time do you think he'll come?" Eleanor asked as they finished their meal. "Evening, like he said. He'll want the full day to plan, maybe bring more men." Caleb's jaw tightened. "Eleanor, I want you to promise me something. If things go bad today, if it looks like he might take you by force, I want you to run. Take Sage and ride for town, find Judge Patterson. Tell him everything. I won't leave you to face them alone. You will if I tell you to," Caleb said firmly. "I can handle myself, but I can't fight and protect you at the same time. Promise me." Eleanor studied his face, reading the determination there, the love that made him willing to sacrifice himself for her safety. "I promise," she said finally, "but only if you promise me something in return." "What?" "Promise me you won't throw your life away out of some misguided sense of honor. If they outnumber you too badly, if the odds are impossible, promise me you'll surrender. I won't have your death on my conscience." Caleb wanted to argue, wanted to tell her that some things were worth dying for, but the look in her eyes stopped him. She'd lost too much already, endured too much pain. He couldn't add to her suffering by dying a hero's death that would leave her alone and defenseless. "I promise," he said. They spent the day in careful preparation. Caleb cleaned and loaded his rifle, checked his pistol, made sure the horses were ready in case they needed to run. Eleanor packed essential supplies into saddlebags, her movements efficient, despite the fear that gnawed at her stomach like hunger. As afternoon faded toward evening, they stood together on the porch, watching the horizon for signs of riders. The air was crisp and still, the snow pristine except for the tracks of rabbits and deer. It would have been beautiful, if not for the tension that stretched between them, like a wire about to snap. "There," Caleb said quietly, pointing toward the valley road. Eleanor saw them, then dark shapes against the white landscape, more than the three who had come yesterday. Samuel had brought reinforcements, 5 men in total, all of them armed and riding with purpose. 5 of them, Eleanor breathed. "Caleb, the odds." "I know." His voice was grim but steady. "But we're not backing down. Not now." The riders approached at a deliberate pace, spreading out as they neared the house in a formation that spoke of military experience, or at least criminal expertise. Samuel rode in the center, his dark beard visible beneath his hat, his posture radiating confidence. They stopped about 30 yards away just outside easy rifle range, and Samuel dismounted with theatrical casualness. He was dressed better today, a good coat, polished boots, the kind of clothes a man wore when he wanted to make an impression. "Afternoon, folks," he called out cheerfully. "Trust you had a productive evening." Caleb stepped forward, his rifle held casually but ready. "What do you want, Morrison?" "You know what I want? Proof that your marriage is legitimate. Proof that Eleanor belongs to you instead of me." Eleanor moved to stand beside Caleb, her chin lifted defiantly. "I told you yesterday I'm a married woman now. That should be proof enough." Samuel laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Should be, sweetheart, but it's not. See, I did some checking with the good folks in town. Seems there's no record of any marriage ceremony, no witnesses, no legal documentation. So as far as the law is concerned, you're still just a runaway debtor." "The law recognizes common law marriage," Caleb said evenly. "Does it? And how exactly does one prove a common law marriage?" Samuel's smile was ugly. "Why, through evidence of consummation, of course. And since I doubt you'd be willing to provide such evidence publicly," he let the implication hang in the air like poison. Eleanor felt her cheeks burn with humiliation and rage. Even here, even in what should have been the sanctuary of her new home, Samuel was trying to reduce her to an object, a piece of property, to be examined and evaluated. "You're disgusting," she said coldly. "I'm thorough," Samuel corrected, "and I'm still waiting for proof." One of his men, a nervous-looking character with darting eyes, shifted in his saddle. "Samuel, maybe we should just shut up, Pete." Samuel's attention never wavered from Eleanor and Caleb. "I'm not leaving without what I came for." The wind picked up, sending snow swirling around the horses' legs. In the distance, clouds were gathering over the mountains again, promising another storm. Eleanor could feel the situation spiraling toward violence, could see it in the way Caleb's grip had tightened on his rifle, in the expectant tension of the mounted men. And suddenly, she knew what she had to do. You want proof? Eleanor stepped forward, her voice ringing clear in the cold air. Fine, but you'll get it on my terms. Both Caleb and Samuel looked at her in surprise. She ignored them both, focusing instead on the crowd of men who had come to treat her like a prize in some grotesque auction. I am Eleanor Boone, she declared, using her married name with deliberate emphasis. Wife to Caleb Boone, mistress of this ranch, and free woman under the laws of Wyoming Territory. Last night I gave myself willingly to my husband, as was my right to do. We consummated our marriage in the eyes of God and nature, and if that's not enough proof for you, then you can ride back to Pennsylvania and explain to whoever sent you that Eleanor Mayfield is dead. She died the moment she chose love over bondage. The words rang out like a battle cry carried on the wind across the snow-covered valley. For a moment, no one moved, no one spoke. Then Samuel's face darkened with rage. Pretty speech, sweetheart, but words don't change facts. You're still coming with me. No, Eleanor said simply. I'm not. Samuel's hand dropped to his gun. I think you are. That's when Caleb stepped forward, his rifle coming up to his shoulder in one smooth motion. She said no, Morrison. That's the end of it. 5 against 1 cowboy. Not very good odds. Good enough, Caleb replied calmly. Question is, which one of you wants to die first? The standoff stretched like a taut wire, ready to snap at the slightest provocation. Eleanor could feel her heart hammering against her ribs, could see the way the mounted men were shifting nervously, hands hovering near their weapons. And then cutting through the tension like a knife came the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Everyone turned toward the sound, and Eleanor's heart leaped with hope as she recognized the rider approaching at a gallop. It was old Pete Henderson, the stagecoach driver, but he wasn't alone. Behind him rode a man in a dark coat and official-looking hat, Judge Patterson, the territorial justice of the peace. The two riders pulled up short at the edge of the confrontation, and Judge Patterson dismounted with the authority of a man accustomed to commanding respect. He was in his 60s with silver hair and sharp blue eyes that took in the scene with practiced assessment. Well, well, he said mildly. Seems I arrived just in time. Mr. Morrison, isn't it, from Pennsylvania? Samuel's face had gone pale. Judge Patterson, what brings you all the way out here? Received an interesting telegram this morning, the judge replied, pulling a paper from his coat. Seems there are some questions about the legal status of Mrs. Eleanor Boone and whether certain documents from Pennsylvania have any validity in Wyoming Territory. Eleanor felt hope bloom in her chest like a flower opening to sunlight. Someone had sent word to the judge, but who? As if reading her thoughts, Judge Patterson smiled. Mrs. Boone, your friend, Mr. Whitfield in town, sends his regards. Seems he was concerned about your welfare when he heard about visitors asking questions. Marcus Whitfield, the man who had introduced her to Caleb through his letter. Eleanor could have wept with gratitude. Now then, Judge Patterson continued, turning his attention to Samuel and his men. Let's discuss these documents you've been waving around, shall we? Because according to territorial law, any contract that treats a human being as property for debt collection is null and void. Has been since we achieved territorial status. Samuel's jaw worked furiously. Those debts are legal under Pennsylvania law. But we're not in Pennsylvania, are we? The judge interrupted smoothly. We're in Wyoming Territory, where a woman's debts die with her husband and cannot be transferred to his creditors. Where a woman has the right to choose her own spouse and cannot be forced into servitude to pay another's obligations. The legal pronouncement fell like a hammer blow. Eleanor saw the exact moment when Samuel realized his carefully laid plans had crumbled to dust, saw the rage and frustration war with the knowledge that he'd been outmaneuvered. Furthermore, Judge Patterson continued, I have here a properly witnessed and notarized certificate of marriage between Eleanor Mayfield and Caleb Boone, dated yesterday evening. The ceremony was performed by myself via proxy with Mr. Whitfield and Mrs. Henderson serving as witnesses. Eleanor stared at the judge in amazement. But how? Telegraph is a wonderful invention, Judge Patterson explained with a twinkle in his eyes. Mr. Whitfield was quite persuasive about the urgency of the situation. The law allows for emergency marriages in cases where the bride's safety is at risk, and this certainly qualified. Samuel's face had gone from pale to flushed with fury. This is a farce, a legal trick. This is the law, Judge Patterson corrected firmly. And if you continue to harass Mrs. Boone or threaten her lawful husband, I'll have you arrested for intimidation and assault. We have laws against that sort of thing, too. For a long moment, Samuel stood frozen in impotent rage, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Eleanor could see him calculating, weighing his options, considering whether to push the confrontation into open violence. But 5 against 1 had become 5 against 3, with the weight of territorial law on the side of the 3. And Judge Patterson, for all his mild demeanor, carried a gun beneath his coat and the authority to use it. "This isn't over," Samuel said, finally, his voice thick with barely controlled fury. "I won't forget this, Eleanor, and I won't give up." "Yes, you will," Eleanor said, her voice steady and strong, "because you have no choice. I'm free, Samuel, free to choose my own life, my own future, my own happiness. And I choose to be Eleanor Boone, wife to a good man who sees me as more than property to be owned." Samuel mounted his horse with jerky movements, his face a mask of frustrated rage. "Come on," he snarled to his men. "Let's get out of this godforsaken wilderness." They rode away at a gallop, disappearing into the gathering dusk like the nightmare they'd been. Eleanor watched them go until they were just dark specks on the horizon, then turned to find Caleb watching her with an expression of wonder and pride. "Mrs. Boone," he said softly, and the name sounded like music on his lips. "Mr. Boone," she replied, tears of relief and joy streaming down her cheeks. Judge Patterson cleared his throat diplomatically. "Well, now that's settled. I believe congratulations are in order. Mrs. Boone, Mr. Boone, welcome to married life." As if by mutual agreement, they moved toward each other, and when Eleanor threw herself into Caleb's arms, he caught her and spun her around, both of them laughing with the sheer relief of survival and the promise of a future they could build together. The storm clouds gathered overhead, but neither of them cared. They had weathered a different kind of storm, and they had come through it stronger than before, not just two lonely souls seeking shelter from the world, but true partners bound together by choice, by law, and by something deeper than either. The wind picked up, promising snow before midnight, but inside the circle of Caleb's arms, Eleanor felt nothing but warmth. Judge Patterson stayed for supper that evening, regaling them with stories of territorial politics and the challenges of bringing law to a land where justice had previously been dispensed at the end of a gun barrel. Eleanor found herself laughing more than she had in years. The weight of Samuel's threat finally lifted from her shoulders, like a heavy cloak she could finally shed. The telegram from Marcus arrived just after dawn. The judge explained over coffee and the apple pie Eleanor had somehow managed to produce from their meager supplies. "He was quite concerned about your welfare, Mrs. Boone. Said he'd heard talk in town about strangers asking questions, making threats." "We owe him a debt of gratitude," Caleb said, his hand finding Eleanor's across the rough wooden table. "Without his intervention." "Without his intervention, you two would have found another way," Judge Patterson replied with certainty. "I've seen enough marriages in my time to recognize the real thing when I see it. You may have started this as a business arrangement, but what I witnessed today was two people genuinely committed to protecting each other. That's the foundation of every good marriage I've ever performed." Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks, but it was warmth rather than embarrassment. For the first time in her adult life, she was part of something that others recognized as real, as valuable, as worth protecting. After the judge departed for town, refusing their offer of a bed for the night, saying he preferred to travel while the weather held, Eleanor and Caleb found themselves alone again in the house that had become truly theirs. The silence that settled between them was comfortable now, charged not with tension, but with possibility. "So," Caleb said, banking the fire for the night, "Mrs. Boone, how does it feel to be legally, officially, and irrevocably married?" Eleanor considered the question seriously. "Free," she said finally. "For the first time in my life, I feel completely free." "Free to do what?" She moved to the window, looking out at the star-filled sky that stretched endlessly over their valley. "Free to choose, free to stay or go to speak, or remain silent, to love or withhold love. Free to be myself without asking permission or fearing punishment." Caleb joined her at the window, his reflection ghost-like in the glass beside hers. "And what do you choose, Eleanor Boone?" She turned to face him. her violet eyes bright with tears that were entirely happy. I choose this. I choose you. I choose the life we're going to build together in this beautiful, impossible place. The kiss that followed was different from their tentative explorations of the previous night. This was the kiss of two people who had faced down their demons together and emerged victorious, two souls who had found in each other not just refuge, but home. Winter settled over the ranch with a vengeance in the weeks that followed. Snow piled higher than the windowsills, and the wind howled down from the mountains with a voice like hungry wolves. But inside the snug log house, Eleanor and Caleb created their own season of warmth and discovery. Eleanor threw herself into the business of being a rancher's wife, with the same determination she'd once applied to surviving Thomas's cruelties. She learned to read the sky for weather signs, to tend the livestock with confidence, to preserve food and mend clothes, and make their meager supplies stretch through the long months of isolation. But more than that, she learned to laugh again. Caleb proved to have a dry sense of humor that perfectly complemented her own quieter wit, and their conversations around the fire in the evenings became the highlight of both their days. They talked about everything: books they'd read, places they'd seen, dreams they'd thought were forever out of reach. I always wanted to see the ocean, Eleanor confessed one snowy evening as they worked together on a quilt, her fingers nimble with the needle while Caleb held the frame steady. When I was little, I used to imagine what it would sound like, all that water moving at once. Maybe we'll go someday, Caleb said, when the ranch is more established, when we can afford to travel. San Francisco isn't that far, not really. The casual way he said "we" sent warmth flooding through Eleanor's chest. After years of being told her wants and dreams were foolish, irrelevant, it was a revelation to have someone not only listen to them, but help her plan how to make them real. "What about you?" she asked. "What did you dream about before?" "Before I became a killer, you mean?" Caleb's voice was matter of fact, but Eleanor heard the old pain underneath. "I wanted to be a teacher, believe it or not. Loved books, loved learning. Had this idea that I could open a school somewhere, help children discover that the world was bigger and more wonderful than whatever small corner they'd been born into." Eleanor set down her needle and looked at him with wonder. "You still could. There are children in the valley, families scattered through the territory. They need education, and you're the smartest man I've ever met." "I'm also a man with blood on his hands," Caleb reminded her gently. "Parents don't generally want their children taught by former killers. They want their children taught by good men," Eleanor corrected. "And you are a good man, Caleb Boone. Whatever you did in the past, whoever you were before, you're good now. I see it in the way you treat the animals, the way you take care of me, the way you're trying to build something honest and decent here." He reached across the quilt frame to cup her face in his palm, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone. "How do you do that?" "Do what?" "Make me believe I might actually deserve a second chance." Eleanor turned her face to press a kiss into his palm. "The same way you make me believe I was never worthless to begin with by seeing the truth, when everyone else sees only what they expect to see." Christmas came and went, quietly marked by the small gifts they'd managed to make for each other in secret: a new shirt Eleanor had sewn from fabric she'd found in the bottom of her trunk, a wooden jewelry box Caleb had carved with intricate roses during the long evenings when she thought he was simply whittling. They celebrated with a feast of roasted chicken and dried apple fritters, and Eleanor declared it the best Christmas of her life. "Better than when you were a child?" Caleb asked, genuinely curious. "Much better. When I was a child, Christmas was about duty and obligation, being grateful for what I was given whether I wanted it or not, acting properly for the relatives who came to judge our family's respectability. This is the first Christmas I've ever had that was about joy." The new year brought changes beyond the simple turning of the calendar. Eleanor began to notice small differences in herself, a heightened sensitivity to certain smells, a bone-deep exhaustion that no amount of sleep seemed to cure, a strange fluttering sensation low in her belly that she initially attributed to anxiety about Samuel's threats. It was Caleb who first suspected the truth, watching with growing concern as Eleanor pushed away her breakfast for the third morning in a row and hurried outside to be sick behind the chicken coop. "Eleanor, he said gently when she returned pale and shaky. "When was your last monthly time?" The question stopped her cold. She'd been so focused on the dramatic changes in her life, so caught up in learning to be a wife and a ranch woman, that she hadn't paid attention to the subtle rhythms of her own body. I... She thought back, calculating dates with growing amazement. 7 weeks ago, maybe 8. They stared at each other across the kitchen, the magnitude of the realization settling between them like snow falling on still water. Eleanor's hand moved instinctively to her stomach, and Caleb's eyes followed the gesture. "Are you sure?" he asked softly. "No. Maybe. Yes." Eleanor laughed, a sound caught between wonder and terror. "Oh God, Caleb, I think I'm going to have a baby." The joy that transformed his face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. In 2 quick strides, he crossed the kitchen and swept her into his arms, spinning her around until they were both dizzy with laughter and possibility. "A baby," he repeated, as if testing the word for its reality. "Our baby." "Are you happy?" Eleanor asked, sudden uncertainty clouding her features. "I know we never talked about children, never planned." "Happy." Caleb set her down gently, his hands coming to rest on either side of her face. "Eleanor, I'm beyond happy. I'm terrified and thrilled and amazed all at once. A baby, a new life, something we made together out of love and hope." Eleanor felt tears streaming down her cheeks, but for once they were tears of pure joy. "I never thought I could have children. Thomas always said, he blamed me when I didn't conceive, said it was proof of my worthlessness." "Thomas was a fool," Caleb said fiercely. "This baby is proof of exactly the opposite proof that you're perfect, that we're perfect together, that love can create life even in the hardest places." The weeks that followed were a blur of preparation and anticipation. Eleanor's morning sickness gradually faded, replaced by a glowing energy that seemed to light her from within. Caleb became almost comically protective, insisting she avoid any task that might be remotely strenuous and fussing over her diet with the dedication of a mother hen. "I'm pregnant, not made of glass," Eleanor protested one afternoon when he tried to carry her across a puddle that was barely ankle deep. "You're carrying our child," Caleb corrected solemnly. "That makes you the most precious thing in this territory, and I'm going to treat you accordingly." His devotion was sweet, if occasionally overwhelming. Eleanor had never experienced the luxury of being treasured, of having someone consider her comfort and well-being more important than their own convenience. It took some adjustment to accept such care without feeling guilty or obligated to reciprocate in kind. Spring arrived late that year, with snow still covering the ground well into April. But when it finally came, it came with a rush of green that transformed the valley almost overnight. Wildflowers carpeted the meadows, the creek ran high and swift with snowmelt, and the air filled with the songs of returning birds. Eleanor's pregnancy became more obvious as the weather warmed her waist, thickening, and her movements taking on the careful grace of a woman carrying precious cargo. She bloomed like the wildflowers around their home, her hair growing lustrous, and her skin taking on a luminous quality that made Caleb catch his breath every time he looked at her. "You're beautiful," he told her one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. "I know I tell you that every day, but I need you to really hear it. You're the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." Eleanor rested her hand on the gentle swell of her belly, feeling the first tentative movements of the life growing inside her. "I feel beautiful," she admitted. "For the first time in my life, I feel like I understand what that word really means." It was that same evening that they saw the riders approaching 3 men on horseback coming up the valley road at a leisurely pace that suggested they weren't in any particular hurry. Caleb tensed automatically, his hand moving toward the rifle that was never far from reach, but Eleanor placed a restraining hand on his arm. "It's not Samuel," she said with certainty. "These men aren't trying to intimidate anyone." She was right. As the riders drew closer, they could see that the lead man was older, gray-haired, with the weathered look of someone who'd spent his life outdoors. Behind him rode 2 younger men who had the unmistakable bearing of law enforcement officers. The older man dismounted when they reached the porch, removing his hat with old-world courtesy. "Mrs. Boone, Mr. Boone. I'm Sheriff Davies from Buffalo County, Pennsylvania. These are my deputies Matthews and Cole." Eleanor felt her blood turn to ice water, but Caleb's hand found hers and squeezed reassuringly. "Sheriff," he said evenly. What brings you all the way to Wyoming? I'm afraid I have some news about Samuel Morrison. Sheriff Davies said, his expression grave. Wanted to deliver it in person seemed like the right thing to do. What kind of news, Gitte? Eleanor asked, though some part of her already knew. He's dead, ma'am. Shot and killed 3 days after he returned from his visit to Wyoming territory. Seems he got into a disagreement with some men he owed money to, men who didn't take kindly to his failure to collect on what he claimed was a sure thing. Eleanor sank into the chair behind her, the magnitude of the news hitting her like a physical blow. Samuel Morrison, the man who had terrorized her nightmares and threatened her new happiness, was dead. How? Caleb asked quietly. Gunfight outside a saloon in Philadelphia. Morrison drew first, but he was drunk and angry and not thinking clearly. The other fellow was a professional gambler, sober, fast, and accurate. Morrison was dead before he hit the ground. The sheriff studied Eleanor's face with kind eyes. I wanted you to know, Mrs. Boone, that you're completely safe now. All of Morrison's claims against you died with him, and his estate isn't interested in pursuing the matter. You're free to live your life without looking over your shoulder. Eleanor nodded, unable to speak around the tightness in her throat. It was over. Really, truly over. Samuel Morrison would never threaten her again, never try to drag her back to Pennsylvania, never again make her feel like property to be owned and used. There's something else, Sheriff Davies continued, reaching into his coat. Found this among Morrison's effects. Thought you might want to have it. He handed Eleanor a small leather pouch, worn smooth by years of handling. Inside, she found her mother's wedding ring, the one Thomas had sold during a particularly bad gambling streak, the one she'd thought was lost forever. My mother's ring, she whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. I thought I'd never see it again. Seems Morrison bought it back from whoever Thomas sold it to, Sheriff Davies explained. Probably planned to use it as leverage against you somehow. Now it can go where it belongs. Eleanor slipped the ring onto her right hand where it caught the evening light like a promise. Her mother's love returned to her just as she was about to become a mother herself. It seemed like a sign of blessing from beyond the grave. After the sheriff and his deputies departed, Eleanor and Caleb sat in the gathering twilight, both of them struggling to process the magnitude of what they'd learned. The threat that had shadowed their marriage from its very beginning was gone, removed not by their own actions, but by the twisted logic of Samuel's own violent nature. How do you feel? Caleb asked gently. Eleanor considered the question carefully. Free, she said finally, but also sad. Not for Samuel, he chose his path and paid the price for it. But sad for all the years I spent being afraid, all the energy I wasted on fear instead of living. You're living now, Caleb pointed out. We both are, and we have so much life ahead of us, years and years, to make up for everything we missed. Eleanor's hand moved to her belly where their child was growing strong and healthy. Do you think we'll be good parents? I think we'll be the kind of parents we wished we'd had, Caleb replied. The kind who see their children as individuals worthy of love and respect, not possessions to be controlled or investments to be managed. As if in response to his words, Eleanor felt a sharp kick from within, strong enough to make her gasp. I think our little one agrees with you, she said, laughing despite her tears. Caleb's hand joined hers on her belly, and together they felt the life they'd created moving and growing, preparing to enter a world that would be kinder to it than the world had been to either of them. Summer brought new challenges and new joys. Eleanor's pregnancy progressed smoothly, though the heat made her uncomfortable, and the growing weight of the baby made many of her usual tasks more difficult. Caleb hired a local woman, Mrs. Patterson, the judge's wife, to come stay with them as Eleanor's time approached, and the older woman's calm competence was a source of great comfort. First babies can be unpredictable, Mrs. Patterson explained as she helped Eleanor prepare the birthing room, but you're strong and healthy, and Dr. Morrison from town will come when we send word. Everything will be fine. It was Dr. Morrison, no relation to Samuel, thankfully, who delivered their son on a sweltering August afternoon while thunderclouds gathered over the mountains. Eleanor's labor was long and difficult, but when she finally held her baby for the first time, all the pain was forgotten in the wonder of looking into his perfect little face. He's beautiful, Caleb whispered, his voice thick with emotion as he gazed down at his son. Look at him, Eleanor. Look what we made." The baby had Caleb's dark hair and Eleanor's violet eyes, and from the moment he drew his first breath, he made it clear that he had inherited both parents' stubborn determination. His cries were lusty and indignant, as if he were protesting the indignity of being forced from his warm, dark sanctuary into the bright, noisy world. "What should we call him?" Eleanor asked, exhausted but radiant with joy. They had discussed names throughout the pregnancy, but had never quite settled on one that felt right. Now looking at their son's face, Caleb felt certainty settle in his chest, like a puzzle piece finding its proper place. "Daniel," he said, "Daniel Hope Boone, for new beginnings and the faith that brought us together." Eleanor smiled through her tears. "Daniel Hope Boone. It's perfect." The weeks that followed were a blur of sleepless nights and overwhelming love. Eleanor marveled at how completely this tiny person had reorganized their entire world, how everything else seemed insignificant compared to the miraculous fact of his existence. Caleb proved to be a devoted father, walking the floor with Daniel during his colicky evenings and insisting on taking turns with the night feedings, despite Eleanor's protests that she was perfectly capable of managing. "He's my son too," Caleb would say when she tried to argue. "I want to do my share." It was during one of those late-night feedings with Daniel nursing contentedly at Eleanor's breast, while Caleb dozed in the chair beside them, that she finally understood what Judge Patterson had meant about recognizing real marriages. This was what love looked like, not the grand gestures or passionate declarations of romantic novels, but the quiet devotion of two people committed to building something together, day by day, choice by choice. As autumn painted the mountains in brilliant reds and golds, Eleanor found herself thinking often about the journey that had brought her to this moment. Less than a year ago, she had been a frightened woman running from a past that seemed determined to destroy her. Now she was Eleanor Boone wife and mother co-owner of a thriving ranch, a woman who knew her own worth and refused to accept anything less than the love and respect she deserved. The transformation hadn't been easy or quick, and there were still moments when the old fears tried to reassert themselves. But each time doubt crept in, she had only to look at Caleb's face when he held their son or feel Daniel's tiny hand curl around her finger to remember that she had chosen correctly. She had chosen love over fear, hope over despair, and the reward had been greater than anything she could have imagined. One crisp October evening, as they sat before the fire with Daniel sleeping peacefully in Eleanor's arms, Caleb looked up from the book he'd been reading aloud, a collection of poems by Walt Whitman that had arrived in their last supply order from town. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked quietly. "Any of it? Leaving Pennsylvania, marrying a stranger, building a life in the middle of nowhere?" Eleanor considered the question seriously, as she always did when Caleb asked something important. Outside, the wind was picking up, promising the first snow of the season, but inside their small house, all was warmth and contentment. "Never," she said finally. "Not for a single moment. This life, this family, this love, it's more than I ever dared to dream possible. I'm exactly where I belong." Caleb set down his book and moved to sit beside her on the small sofa, careful not to disturb the sleeping baby. "I love you, Eleanor Boone," he said simply. "I love you more than I ever thought I could love anyone or anything." "I love you too," Eleanor replied, her voice soft with wonder at how easy those words had become, how natural it felt to speak them without fear or reservation. "I love our life. I love our son, and I love the future we're going to build together." As if summoned by their conversation, Daniel stirred in her arms, his tiny face scrunching into the expression that usually preceded a demand for food or attention. But this time, instead of crying, he simply opened his violet eyes and looked up at his parents with the solemn gravity of someone who understood on some deep level that he was exactly where he belonged too. The first snow began to fall as Eleanor settled Daniel to nurse the white flakes dancing past the windows, like blessings from a generous sky. Winter was coming with all its challenges and hardships, but this time Eleanor faced it without fear. She had Caleb beside her, Daniel in her arms, and the unshakable knowledge that she was finally truly home. Winter's grip tightened on the valley with unprecedented ferocity that year, bringing blizzards that lasted for days and temperatures that made the previous year's cold seem mild by comparison. But inside the Boone house, warmth radiated from more than just the crackling fireplace. Daniel grew stronger each day, his cries becoming more purposeful, his movements more coordinated, and his smiles when they came bright enough to melt the frost from the windows. It was during a particularly brutal February storm that Caleb fell ill. What started as a minor cough from working too long in the bitter cold quickly developed into something more serious. By the third day, he was burning with fever, his breathing labored and his body racked with chills that no amount of blankets could ease. "You need to get Dr. Morrison," Eleanor told him as she pressed a cool cloth to his forehead, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. "This isn't just a cold, Caleb. This is pneumonia." "Can't," he mumbled through chattering teeth. "Storm's too bad, roads are impassable, and someone needs to tend the stock." Eleanor looked out at the white wall of wind and snow beyond the windows and felt panic rise in her throat. The nearest neighbor was 5 miles away, the doctor 15 miles beyond that, and the storm showed no signs of letting up. She was trapped here with a sick husband, a 3-month-old baby, and livestock that would die without care. But even as the fear threatened to overwhelm her, something else rose within Eleanor, something steel-hard and unbreakable, that she recognized as the same strength that had carried her away from Thomas, that had brought her across 1,000 miles to start over, that had given her the courage to face down Samuel Morrison. She was not the same frightened woman who had stepped off that stagecoach barely 18 months ago. She was Eleanor Boone, and she would not let her family suffer for lack of courage. "Then I'll tend the stock," she said firmly, tucking the blankets more securely around Caleb's shivering form. "And I'll take care of you too. We're going to get through this." Caleb tried to protest, but another fit of coughing seized him, leaving him too weak to argue. Eleanor kissed his burning forehead and set about the business of survival with the methodical determination of someone who had learned that panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. She bundled Daniel in every warm garment she could find and carried him to the barn in a makeshift sling fashioned from one of Caleb's shirts. The wind nearly knocked her off her feet, and the snow was so thick she could barely see the outline of the building, but she fought her way through the drifts with grim persistence. The animals were huddled together for warmth, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Sage whickered nervously when Eleanor entered, sensing the absence of her usual caretaker, and even ornery Bessie seemed subdued by the unusual circumstances. "I know," Eleanor murmured to the mare as she struggled to fill the water troughs with hands already numb from cold. "I'm not him, but I'm what you've got right now, so we'll just have to make the best of it." The work took twice as long as it should have, partly because of her inexperience, and partly because she had to stop frequently to check on Daniel, who remained mercifully quiet in his improvised carrier. By the time she finished feeding and watering all the animals, her fingers were so stiff she could barely manage the barn door latch. Back in the house, she found Caleb delirious with fever, mumbling about the war and calling out names she didn't recognize. Eleanor fed Daniel and put him down for a nap, then turned her attention to nursing her husband with the same fierce determination she'd applied to the livestock. She brewed willow bark tea for his fever-forced water down his throat, drop by drop to prevent dehydration, and kept wet cloths on his forehead to cool his burning skin. When his breathing became so labored she feared he might stop altogether, she sat him up against her chest and held him while he fought for each breath, her own tears falling silently into his dark hair. "Don't you dare leave me," she whispered fiercely during the worst of it, when his fever spiked so high she thought she might lose him. "Don't you dare make me raise our son alone. I need you, Caleb Boone. We both need you. So you fight this thing. Do you hear me? You fight it, and you come back to us." Whether it was her words, her nursing, or simple stubborn determination on Caleb's part, the fever finally broke on the 4th day. Eleanor woke from an exhausted doze in the chair beside their bed to find him looking at her with clear, lucid eyes for the first time in days. "Eleanor?" His voice was barely a whisper rough from coughing, but it was the most beautiful sound she'd ever heard. "I'm here," she said, reaching for his hand and finding it blessedly cool. "The fever's broken. You're going to be all right." Caleb squeezed her fingers weakly. "The animals are fine. Fed and watered twice a day, just like you taught me. Daniel's fine too, sleeping in his cradle and growing bigger every day. We're all fine, Caleb. We made it through." Tears leaked from the corners of his eyes as the full implications of what she'd done sank in. "You saved us all. You saved everything." We saved each other, Eleanor corrected, bringing his hand to her lips. That's what families do. The storm finally blew itself out 2 days later, leaving behind a world transformed by snow so deep it reached the windowsills. When the first neighbor arrived to check on them, old Henrik Jensen from the next valley over, he found Eleanor chopping wood behind the house while Daniel napped in a basket nearby, Caleb recovering in bed, and all the livestock healthy and well-tended. "My God, woman," Henrik said in his thick Norwegian accent, staring at Eleanor as if she'd sprouted wings. "How did you manage all this alone?" Eleanor straightened from her work, wiping sweat from her forehead despite the bitter cold. "You do what needs doing," she said simply. "There's no other choice." Word of Eleanor's feat spread quickly through the scattered ranching community, and she found herself regarded with a new kind of respect. She was no longer just the mail-order bride who'd married Caleb Boone. She was the woman who'd kept a ranch running single-handed during the worst blizzard in memory, who'd nursed her husband back from the brink of death while caring for an infant and keeping livestock alive in conditions that would have defeated many grown men. But more important than the admiration of neighbors was the change Eleanor felt within herself. She had been tested by circumstances that would have broken the frightened woman she'd once been, and she had not just survived, but prevailed. The last vestiges of doubt about her own strength and capability had been burned away in the crucible of that terrible week, leaving behind a confidence that no one could ever take from her again. Spring arrived late, but with a vengeance, turning the snow-locked valley into a riot of green and wildflowers almost overnight. Caleb regained his strength slowly, though the illness had left him with a persistent cough that Dr. Morrison warned might never fully disappear. "Lung fever changes a man," the doctor explained during his first post-storm visit to the ranch. "You'll always be more susceptible to respiratory ailments, more vulnerable to cold and damp. But you're alive, which is more than many can say who've faced what you faced." Eleanor watched Caleb absorb this news with the same quiet acceptance he'd shown for every other hardship life had thrown at him. He would adapt as he always did, finding ways to work around his limitations without complaint or self-pity. "Means I'll have to rely on my wife even more," he said, with a slight smile catching Eleanor's hand in his. "Good thing she's proven herself more than capable." As summer approached and Daniel began to show signs of wanting to sit up and explore his world, Eleanor found herself thinking more and more about the conversation they'd had the previous winter about opening a school. The valley was slowly filling with families and children needed education if the frontier was ever to become something more than a collection of isolated homesteads. "I've been thinking about what you said," she told Caleb one evening as they sat on the porch watching Daniel attempt to catch fireflies from his blanket on the ground. "About teaching, about starting a school." Caleb's eyebrows rose in surprise. "I thought you said I was the one who should teach." "I said you were smart enough to teach," Eleanor corrected. "But after this winter, after everything that's happened, I think we should do it together. You have the education and the knowledge, I have the practical experience of dealing with difficult situations. Together we could offer these children something neither of us could provide alone." The idea took root, quickly fed by their shared enthusiasm and the very real need in their community. By midsummer, they had converted the old bunkhouse into a one-room schoolhouse, complete with benches built by Caleb and a blackboard Eleanor had ordered from the Sears catalog. When they announced their intention to begin classes in the fall, 7 families immediately committed to sending their children. "It's not much," Eleanor said, looking around the simple classroom with its rough-hewn furniture and single window. "Not compared to the schools back east." "It's everything," Caleb disagreed. "It's hope. It's the future. It's proof that civilization doesn't have to mean losing what makes this place special." Their first day of school dawned bright and clear in early September, with children ranging in age from 6 to 15 filling the benches with nervous excitement. Eleanor found herself thinking of her own childhood, of the hunger for knowledge that had been discouraged as inappropriate for a girl, and felt a fierce determination to give these children, boys and girls alike, every opportunity to learn and grow. "Good morning, students," she said, standing beside Caleb at the front of the room. "Welcome to the Willow Valley School. I'm Mrs. Boone, and this is Mr. Boone. We're here because we believe that education is the most powerful tool anyone can possess, and we want to give you that tool." Caleb stepped forward, his presence commanding attention without effort. "Some of you might know that I wasn't always a teacher," I was a soldier, a scout, other things I'm not particularly proud of. But every day I try to be better than I was the day before. That's what education is really about, not just learning facts and figures, but learning to think, to question, to become the best version of yourself possible. The children listened with rapt attention, these frontier youngsters who had grown up with sky and space and the kind of freedom that bred independence. Eleanor could see the intelligence in their eyes, the hunger for knowledge that burned just as brightly here as it did in any city classroom. As the weeks passed, the school became the heart of their small community. Parents lingered after picking up their children to discuss everything from crop prices to territorial politics, and the classroom often hosted evening meetings and social gatherings. Eleanor found herself serving not just as a teacher, but as a counselor mediator and sometimes confessor to families struggling with the challenges of frontier life. It was during one such evening, gathering in late October, that a familiar figure appeared in the doorway of the schoolhouse. Eleanor looked up from the spelling bee she was organizing for the older children and felt her blood turn to ice. The man in the doorway was tall and lean with pale eyes and the kind of cold smile that didn't reach them. He was dressed well too well for the frontier, and his hands had the soft look of someone who'd never done honest physical labor. "Good evening," he said in a cultured voice that carried easily across the room. "I'm looking for Mrs. Eleanor Boone. I have some business to discuss with her." The conversation in the room died instantly, parents instinctively moving closer to their children as they sensed the menace that rolled off the stranger like fog off a lake. Caleb was at Eleanor's side in an instant, his hand resting casually on the butt of the pistol he'd taken to wearing during school hours. "I'm Eleanor Boone," Eleanor said, proud of how steady her voice sounded. "And you are Nathan Whitmore," the man replied with a slight bow. "Attorney at law representing the estate of the late Samuel Morrison. I believe you knew Mr. Morrison." Eleanor felt the ground shift beneath her feet. Samuel was dead. Sheriff Davies had confirmed it personally. What could his estate possibly want with her now more than a year after his death? "Mr. Morrison is dead," Caleb said flatly. "His claims against my wife died with him. We have legal documentation to that effect." "Indeed you do," Whitmore agreed pleasantly. "But I'm not here about any debts or claims. I'm here about a murder." The word dropped into the silence like a stone into still water, sending ripples of shock through the assembled families. Eleanor felt her knees go weak, but she forced herself to remain standing. "What murder?" she managed to ask. "Why the murder of Thomas Mayfield?" "Of course," Whitmore replied. His pale eyes fixed on Eleanor's face like a predator watching prey. "My client has reason to believe that Mr. Mayfield's death was not the result of natural causes, as originally reported. New evidence has come to light suggesting that he was in fact poisoned by his loving wife." The accusation hit Eleanor like a physical blow. Around the room, she could hear the sharp intake of breath from parents who had come to trust and respect her, could see the doubt already beginning to bloom in some of their eyes. "That's ridiculous," Caleb said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Thomas Mayfield died of pneumonia. There was a doctor's certificate, a proper burial. Eleanor was nowhere near him when he died." But poison can be administered weeks before death occurs," Whitmore said with the air of someone delivering fascinating scientific information. "Particularly certain botanical toxins that accumulate in the system over time. And Mrs. Mrs. Boone did have access to her husband's food and drink right up until she disappeared so suddenly after his funeral." Eleanor found her voice, though it came out rougher than she intended. "You're lying. Thomas died of pneumonia. I would never—" "Of course you would say that," Whitmore interrupted smoothly. "But fortunately, justice doesn't depend solely on the word of the accused. I have here a warrant for your arrest signed by a judge in Pennsylvania and validated by the territorial court in Cheyenne." He pulled a folded document from his coat with a flourish, and Eleanor felt the walls of her new life beginning to crumble around her. This couldn't be happening. Not now. Not when she'd finally found peace and purpose and a place in the world where she belonged. But even as despair threatened to overwhelm her, she felt something else rising within her, the same iron strength that had carried her through Samuel's threats through the winter, that had nearly killed Caleb through every challenge life had thrown at her since leaving Pennsylvania. She was not the same broken woman who had fled from one man's cruelty only to face another's obsession. She was Eleanor Boone, teacher and mother and survivor, and she would not go quietly into whatever web of lies this man was spinning. "Let me see that warrant," she said, extending her hand with rock-steady confidence. Whitmore hesitated for just a moment, long enough for Eleanor to realize that something about this entire situation was wrong. A real warrant would be served by a real lawman, not delivered by a private attorney with soft hands and expensive clothes. And the timing was suspicious too, coming just as their school was becoming successful, just as they were building something important in their community. "I think not," Whitmore said finally. "The warrant will be presented to the proper authorities when Mrs. Boone is in custody." "And who exactly are you planning to turn her over to?" Caleb asked, his hand now openly resting on his gun. "Because I don't see any law enforcement officers with you." "I'm fully authorized to take Mrs. Boone into custody and transport her back to Pennsylvania for trial," Whitmore replied, though his confidence seemed to be wavering slightly under Caleb's steady stare. "Authorized by whom?" demanded a new voice from the back of the room. Everyone turned to see Judge Patterson pushing through the crowd, his weathered face grim with determination. "Because as the territorial magistrate for this district, I'd be very interested to see those authorization papers." Eleanor could have wept with relief at the sight of the older man. Judge Patterson had officiated at their marriage, had been a friend and supporter of their school, and most importantly, he knew the law better than anyone within 100 miles. Whitmore's pale eyes flicked nervously between Judge Patterson and Caleb, clearly calculating his odds. "Judge Patterson, how convenient. I'm sure we can work out the proper jurisdictional issues. The only issue here is whether you're carrying valid legal documents or whether you're attempting to kidnap a respectable woman under false pretenses," Judge Patterson interrupted coldly. "So let's see this warrant you claim to have." For a long moment, Whitmore seemed to wrestle with his options. Then, apparently deciding that discretion was the better part of valor, he tucked the document back into his coat. "I can see that this community is protective of Mrs. Boone," he said with a thin smile. "Perhaps it would be better to allow the proper authorities to handle this matter. I'll be in touch with the Territorial Marshal's office in the morning." "You do that," Judge Patterson said evenly, "and I'll be sending a telegram to Pennsylvania to verify the authenticity of your claims. Should be interesting to see what we find out." Whitmore turned to leave but paused at the door to look back at Eleanor. "This isn't over, Mrs. Boone. Justice may be delayed, but it won't be denied. Thomas Mayfield deserves better than to have his murder ignored simply because his killer has found herself a new life." With that parting shot, he disappeared into the night, leaving behind a room full of shaken parents and children. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Henrik Jensen, the Norwegian rancher who had been one of Eleanor's strongest supporters since the winter crisis, stepped forward. "Mrs. Boone," he said in his heavily accented English, "I knew Thomas Mayfield was sick, man, before you ever left Pennsylvania. My cousin Eric wrote letters about it, how bad he was coughing, how weak he became. No poison killed that man. Bad lungs killed him, same as nearly killed your husband last winter." One by one, other parents stepped forward to voice their support. They spoke of Eleanor's character, her dedication to their children, the way she'd proven herself over and over again since arriving in Wyoming. By the time the evening ended, it was clear that whatever Nathan Whitmore's game was, he would find no allies in the Willow Valley community. But as Eleanor and Caleb walked home through the crisp October night, Daniel sleeping peacefully in Eleanor's arms, both of them knew that the threat was far from over. Someone, whether it was surviving members of Samuel Morrison's circle or enemies Thomas had made during his lifetime, was determined to destroy the life they'd built together. "We'll fight this," Caleb said quietly as they reached their porch. "Whatever it takes, however long it takes, we'll fight this thing, and we'll win." Eleanor shifted Daniel to her shoulder and looked up at the star-filled sky that stretched endlessly over their valley. "I know we will," she said with quiet certainty, "because we're not just fighting for ourselves anymore. We're fighting for our son, for our students, for everyone who believes that people can change, can grow, can become better than they were." The weeks that followed were tense with waiting and uncertainty. Judge Patterson's telegram to Pennsylvania revealed that there was indeed an investigation into Thomas Mayfield's death, but that the new evidence Whitmore had mentioned was entirely circumstantial gossip and speculation rather than facts. More disturbing was the revelation that Nathan Whitmore was not in fact working for Thomas's estate, but had been hired by a consortium of creditors who hoped to recover money Thomas had owed them by proving Eleanor had murdered him and thus forfeited any claim to widowhood protections. "It's about money," Judge Patterson explained during one of his visits to the ranch. "It's always about money with men like this. They think if they can prove you murdered Thomas, they can seize whatever assets he left behind and come after you for the rest." "But Thomas left nothing but debts," Eleanor protested. "I told you that from the beginning." "Ah, but you left Pennsylvania and came into a marriage with property by, the judge pointed out. In their minds, anything you have now should be available to satisfy Thomas's debts if you're proven to be a murderess." The legal complexities were maddening, but what hurt Eleanor most was the shadow the accusations cast over their school and their standing in the community. Although most of their neighbors remained supportive, some parents began keeping their children home, unwilling to risk association with a woman who might be a poisoner. It was during this difficult period that Eleanor received an unexpected visitor. She was working in the garden behind the house, trying to harvest the last of the autumn vegetables before the first hard frost, when a woman's voice called out from the front yard, "Mrs. Boone, Mrs. Eleanor Boone." Eleanor straightened, brushing dirt from her hands as she walked around to the front of the house. A small elderly woman stood beside a travel-worn buggy, her gray hair neatly pinned beneath a modest hat, and her dark dress speaking of mourning or respectability or both. "I'm Eleanor Boone," Eleanor said, cautiously aware that visitors these days might bring unwelcome news. "My name is Martha Kellerman," the woman said, approaching with the determined stride of someone who had traveled a long way for an important purpose. "I was Thomas Mayfield's neighbor in Pennsylvania. I've come to tell you the truth about how your husband died." Eleanor felt her heart skip a beat. "The truth?" Martha Kellerman nodded grimly. "I was there when he passed child, helped lay him out and prepare him for burial, and I can tell you for certain that Thomas Mayfield died of lung fever just as natural as the sunrise. But more than that, I can tell you who really killed him, if anyone did." "What do you mean?" The older woman's expression darkened. "I mean that Thomas Mayfield killed himself slowly and surely with drink and gambling and the kind of reckless living that would destroy any man's constitution. And I mean that the people trying to pin his death on you are the same ones who enabled his destruction, who lent him money he couldn't repay and encouraged his vices because it profited them." Martha Kellerman had brought more than just testimony. She'd brought documents. Letters from Thomas's doctor detailing his declining health statements from neighbors who had witnessed his deteriorating condition, and most importantly, a confession of sorts that Thomas had written during his final illness, acknowledging his debts and apologizing for the way he'd treated Eleanor. "He knew he was dying," Martha explained as they sat in Eleanor's kitchen, Daniel playing contentedly on the floor between them. "The fever had settled in his lungs, and the doctor told him straight that he didn't have long. That's when he wrote this letter trying to make amends for what he'd done to you. He wanted you to know that he was sorry that he'd never deserved you, and that he hoped you'd find happiness somewhere far away from the mess he'd made." Eleanor read the letter with tears streaming down her face. Not tears of grief for Thomas, but tears of relief at this final proof that she'd been right to leave, right to seek a better life, right to believe that she deserved more than what he'd offered her. "Why didn't you come forward before?" she asked. "When Samuel Morrison was making his claims." "Because I didn't know about those claims until recently," Martha replied. "I've been living with my daughter in California since my husband passed. It wasn't until I came back to settle his affairs that I heard what was being said about you. That's when I knew I had to find you and set the record straight." Martha Kellerman stayed for 3 days, long enough to give a full deposition to Judge Patterson and to meet with Dr. Morrison to provide additional medical details about Thomas's final illness. When she prepared to leave, Eleanor felt as if a weight she'd been carrying for years had finally been lifted from her shoulders. "Thank you," Eleanor said as they stood beside Martha's buggy. "You've given me something I never thought I'd have, the truth." "The truth is what sets us free, child." Martha replied, patting Eleanor's hand with maternal affection. "And you were already free long before I came here. You just needed to know it with your whole heart." Nathan Whitmore made one final attempt to press his case, arriving in Willow Valley with a small army of legal documents and claims of new evidence. But Judge Patterson was ready for him, armed with Martha Kellerman's testimony, Dr. Morrison's medical expertise, and a thorough investigation that had revealed the true nature of Whitmore's clients and their motives. The confrontation took place in the territorial courthouse, with half the valley in attendance to witness the final resolution of the charges against Eleanor. Whitmore presented his case with the smooth confidence of a man accustomed to intimidating frontier communities with big city legal maneuvering, but he quickly discovered that Judge Patterson was no country bumpkin to be impressed by fancy words and dubious documentation. "Mr. Whitmore," the judge said, after listening to an hour of increasingly desperate arguments, "I've reviewed all the evidence presented by both sides, and I find absolutely no basis for the charges against Mrs. Boone. Furthermore, I find your conduct in this matter to be highly questionable and possibly fraudulent. If you persist in this harassment, I'll have you arrested for conspiracy and extortion." Whitmore's pale face flushed red with anger and frustration. "This is a travesty of justice. That woman is a murderess, and she's hiding behind the protection of ignorant frontier sympathizers who don't understand the law." "I understand the law perfectly well," Judge Patterson replied coldly. "Well enough to know that what you're practicing isn't law, it's legalized theft dressed up in fancy language. Now get out of my courtroom before I have you thrown out." As Whitmore gathered his papers and stalked toward the door, Eleanor felt a profound sense of completion settle over her. The past was finally truly finished. Thomas Mayfield could rest in peace. Samuel Morrison's malice had died with him, and the grasping creditors who had tried to use her as a scapegoat for their own greed had been exposed and defeated. "Mrs. Boone," Judge Patterson said as the courtroom began to empty, "the charges against you are dismissed with prejudice. You're free to live your life without looking over your shoulder." Eleanor nodded, too overwhelmed to speak. Beside her, Caleb squeezed her hand, and in his eyes she saw the same profound relief she felt herself. They had weathered yet another storm together and emerged stronger than before. The ride home was quiet, with Daniel sleeping peacefully in Eleanor's arms and the autumn landscape rolling past in shades of gold and crimson. As they crested the hill that overlooked their valley, Eleanor felt a familiar sense of wonder at the beauty of the place they'd chosen to call home. "Do you think it's really over?" she asked Caleb as their house came into view, smoke rising peacefully from the chimney in the still air. "I think it's just beginning," Caleb replied, his voice warm with love and certainty. "The fighting is over, the running is over, the fear is over. Now we get to live." That evening, as they sat before the fire with Daniel crawling between them and the first snow of winter beginning to fall outside the windows, Eleanor reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had begun as a frightened woman fleeing from one man's cruelty, had faced down another man's obsession, had survived threats and challenges that would have broken a lesser spirit. But more than just surviving, she had thrived. She had found love with a man who saw her as an equal partner rather than a possession. She had given birth to a son who would grow up knowing that he was wanted and cherished. She had built a school that was already making a difference in the lives of frontier children. She had created a life of purpose and meaning in a place where the sky stretched endlessly and hope was as vast as the horizon. "I love you, Eleanor Boone," Caleb said softly, echoing the words he spoke to her every night. "I love you too, Caleb Boone," she replied as she always did, but with the added weight of everything they'd overcome together, everything they'd built together, everything they still had ahead of them. Daniel chose that moment to pull himself up against the edge of the sofa, standing unsteadily on his chubby legs and beaming at his parents with the triumphant expression of someone who had just conquered the world. Eleanor laughed, reaching out to steady him, and in that moment she understood that this was what happiness looked like, not the grand gestures or dramatic declarations of romantic novels, but the simple joy of watching your child take his first steps while the man you love sits beside you and snow falls softly outside your windows. The broken woman who had stepped off a dusty stagecoach 2 years ago was gone, replaced by someone stronger, braver, and infinitely more alive. The shy bride who had trembled at her first sight of the vast Wyoming landscape had become a woman who could face down lawyers and creditors and anyone else who dared threaten the life she'd built. And the cowboy who had thought himself irredeemably stained by violence had discovered that love could indeed wash away the past, that family could provide the redemption he'd never thought to seek, that a future built on hope and choice could be stronger than any foundation of fear or obligation. Outside, the wind sang through the eaves of their house, but it no longer sounded lonely to Eleanor's ears. It sounded like freedom, like possibility, like the voice of a land that had given her everything she'd ever dared to dream and more than she'd ever thought to ask for. Winter would come and go as winters always did. Spring would return with its promise of new life and fresh beginnings. Their son would grow tall and strong, would perhaps attend the school his parents had built, would carry forward the legacy of courage and determination they were creating together. And through it all, Eleanor and Caleb would face whatever challenges arose with the unshakable knowledge that they belonged to each other and to this place, that love freely given was the strongest force in the world, and that sometimes the most unlikely partnerships could create the most extraordinary legacies. The fire crackled and danced, painting golden shadows on the walls of their home, and in the distance, beneath the vast canopy of Wyoming stars, their life together stretched ahead like an endless prairie full of possibilities, rich with promise and boundless as the sky above.